Clara Whitmore pressed her hand flat against the smokehouse door and felt the cold iron bite through her palm like a brand. Behind her, 3 ranch hands were still laughing. She didn't turn around. She pushed the door open, stepped inside the dark, and let the shadows swallow her whole. If you've ever been told you weren't enough, not strong enough, not thin enough, not worth enough, stay with me. Because this story is for you. Subscribe to this channel, follow along until the very end, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to Montana. Let's go back to the coldest October anyone in that valley could remember. And let's talk about the woman nobody expected to save them all. The advertisement had been nailed to the post outside Garrison's general store for 11 days before Clara saw it. She had been in Mill Haven for less than an hour, standing at the edge of the main road with her travel bag hanging from one hand, and the last $2 she owned folded inside her coat pocket. The wind off the mountain hit her face the moment she stepped down from the supply wagon that had carried her the final 40 miles into town. The driver hadn't spoken to her once the entire journey. He'd taken her fare, pointed at the bench, and looked the other way. Clara was used to that. She was 28 years old, broad-shouldered, full-figured, and unafraid to take up space in a room, though the world had spent most of her life trying to convince her she shouldn't. She had dark eyes that noticed everything, and a mouth that stayed quiet until she had something worth saying. She wasn't the kind of woman people described as beautiful when they first saw her. She was the kind of woman people eventually realized was extraordinary, usually right around the moment it was too late to undo the way they'd already treated her. The advertisement read, "Ranch hand needed. Blackwood Ranch, smokehouse preparation. Before winter inquire with Ethan Blackwood. Serious applicants only." Clara read it twice. Then she looked up at the mountains. The peaks were already wearing snow. October in Montana didn't ask permission before turning murderous, and those clouds stacking above the timberline weren't making any promises about waiting. She pulled the advertisement off the post, folded it carefully, and put it in her pocket beside her last $2. A woman in a green dress coming out of the mercantile stopped and watched her do it. The woman didn't say anything. She just watched the way people watch something strange, the way you watch a dog try to open a gate. Clara walked past her without a word. Garrison's general store sat at the center of Mill Haven, like the spine of the whole town. Clara pushed through the door, and the warmth hit her first, then the smell of dried beans and tobacco and cured leather, and then the silence, because every man and woman inside stopped what they were doing the moment she walked in. A heavy-set man behind the counter with a gray mustache and suspicious eyes looked at her the way merchants look at someone they've already decided isn't buying anything. "Help you," he said. "I'm looking for Blackwood Ranch," Clara said. "Can you tell me how far out it sits?" The man's eyebrows went up slightly. "Blackwood? That's what I said." A man leaning against the far wall, young, rangy, with a toothpick working the corner of his mouth, let out a short breath that was almost a laugh. "You going to apply for that ranch hand position, ma'am?" Clara looked at him. "I believe that's my business." "Well?" He shifted the toothpick. "Ethan Blackwood is looking for somebody to run the smokehouse before winter comes. That's real work, ma'am. That ain't light work." "I didn't ask whether it was light." "You sure you want to ride out there?" the merchant said, not unkindly, which somehow made it worse. "It's rough country. The position calls for someone who can well handle physical demands." Clara set both hands on the counter. Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "Sir," she said, "I have been salting and smoking meat since I was 9 years old. My father ran one of the finest curing operations in eastern Tennessee. I know hickory from applewood by smell alone. I know how to build a fire that holds temperature through a Montana night, and I know what happens to a ranch that goes into winter without proper stores. So when I ask you how far it is to Blackwood Ranch, I'm not asking for your opinion on whether I'm suited for the work. I'm asking for directions." The store went very quiet. The man with the toothpick stopped working it. The merchant cleared his throat. 6 miles northwest," he said. "Follow the creek road until you see the split rail fence with the black gate." "Thank you," Clara said. She turned and walked back out into the cold. The split-rail fence appeared right where the merchant said it would. Clara had walked the 6 miles, which wasn't the kind of thing she announced or complained about. The travel bag had grown heavier by the 4th mile, and her boots were not built for frozen ground, but she kept moving at the same pace she'd started with because stopping to rest on an open road in October cold was not a reasonable option. The Blackwood Ranch spread out before her like something a tired man had built without any help. The main structure was solid timber and stone, built by someone who knew what they were doing, but everything around it showed the signs of a place running low on resources and will. Fences leaning where they should stand straight, equipment left out that should have been stored. A barn with one door hanging half open at an angle that meant the hinge was broken and no one had gotten around to fixing it. But it was the smokehouse that caught her eye first. It sat about 40 yards from the main building, squat and separate, with a rusted iron chimney pipe and a door that looked like it hadn't been opened in years. Clara stood at the fence gate and looked at it for a long moment. She knew what an abandoned smokehouse meant to a ranch going into winter. She unlatched the gate and walked toward the main house. A man came around the side of the barn before she reached the porch steps. He stopped when he saw her. Ethan Blackwood was 42 years old and carried himself like a man who had been doing the work of 3 people for too long. He was lean in the way men get lean when they skip meals because there are more important things to do. He had dark hair going gray at the temples, a jaw that looked like it had been set hard against the world for several years running, and eyes the color of the November sky, not cold exactly, but not warm either. Just careful. Watching. He looked at Clara the way the merchant had looked at her. Like he was doing a rapid calculation and wasn't sure the numbers added up. "Help you," he said. Clara reached into her pocket and held out the advertisement. "I'm answering this." He took it, looked at her. "I'm Ethan Blackwood." "I know, I'm Clara Whitmore, Miss Whitmore." He said it carefully, measuring. "This position, it isn't domestic work, it isn't cooking. The smokehouse has been shut for 2 years. Getting it functional before the first hard frost is going to take heavy labor," Clara said. "Yes, and expertise, which is why you haven't found anyone for it in 11 days. Something shifted in his expression. She couldn't tell what it was. "What do you know about curing?" he said. "I know your smokehouse needs new hooks on the upper rack because the original iron gauge was too light for full-side cuts, and they'll bend under the weight. I know you'll need to burn the interior before you cure anything in it, because whatever was left in there 2 years ago has contaminated the wood. I know the difference between a green hickory smoke and a seasoned one and why it matters, and I know that if you don't have enough salt on hand right now, you need to get it today, not tomorrow, because the merchant in town only carries so much in a season, and you are not the only ranch in this valley that is behind on winter preparation." Ethan Blackwood was quiet for a moment. "How do you know the hooks are the wrong gauge?" he said. "Because a ranch this size would have processed full-side cuts, and full-side cuts weigh between 80 and 120 pounds. Light gauge iron bends under repeated loading and heat. It's a common error in smokehouses built before 1860. I'm guessing your smokehouse was built around 1855. He looked at her for a long time. 1857, he said. Clara nodded once. Close enough. Cha-cha-shong. He showed her the smokehouse himself. He didn't send a hand to do it. He walked her over, personally, pulled a ring of old keys from his coat, and tried 3 of them before finding the one that worked. The door swung open, and the smell hit them both. Old ash. Rot. The ghost of something that had once been useful. Clara stepped inside. She stood in the middle of the dark space and turned slowly, looking at everything. The hooks, the floor, the fire pit, the ventilation gap near the top of the wall. She reached up and ran her thumb across one of the iron hooks and felt the give in it, the slight bend where someone had loaded it too heavy too often, until the metal memory gave out. "How many cattle you slaughtered this season?" she said. 14 head, Ethan said from the doorway. More planned before the freeze. How much hog? 6. Salt on hand and not enough. I figured. Clara turned to face him. I need coarse salt. 60 pounds minimum more if you can get it. Seasoned hickory already split, not green. and I need 2 days to clean and re-burn this interior before anything goes in. The contamination from the abandoned meat residue will spoil whatever you try to cure if I don't clear it out properly." Ethan leaned against the doorframe with his arms crossed. He was watching her the way a careful man watches something he doesn't fully understand, but has decided might be worth the risk of understanding. "Why'd you leave your last position?" he said. It was a blunt question, the kind that didn't apologize for itself. Clara met his eyes. "Because my employer decided I wasn't suited for the physical demands of the work, despite the fact that I had been performing them for 4 months without complaint and without failure." Why'd he decide that? Because someone told him it looked bad, having a woman of my presentation doing that kind of work. Clara kept her voice level. He was concerned about appearances. I was inconvenient for his reputation, so he thanked me for my service and asked me to go. Ethan was quiet. "That's a fool's decision," he said finally. "Yes," Clara said. "It was." Another silence. "I've got 3 ranch hands," Ethan said. "They're going to have opinions about this. I expect they will. I can't pay much. The ranch is—" He paused. "The ranch is struggling." "I know what a struggling ranch looks like, Mr. Blackwood. I walked in through the gate." Something almost moved in his expression. Not quite a smile, but something in that direction. "What do you want for wages?" he said. "Fair ones," Clara said. "And the authority to run the smokehouse my way without interference. I don't need help. I need supplies and time." He looked at the smokehouse, then at her. Then he reached into his pocket and produced a single iron key, old, heavy, worn smooth at the top from years of handling, and held it out to her. Clara took it. "You've got your supplies," he said. "And your time. Don't waste either." "I don't intend to." Show. The 3 ranch hands were named Garrett Doyle, and a younger one everybody called Skeeter, which apparently had been his nickname since childhood, and had never been retired. Clara learned their names because she made it a point to learn names. She also learned within the first 6 hours that Garrett was the one she was going to have trouble with. He was in his 30s, solid built, and had been working Blackwood Ranch for 4 years. He wasn't a bad man exactly. He was the kind of man who had decided early in life what things were, and who did them, and those decisions had become walls he'd stopped questioning. When he saw Clara carrying the supply order toward the smokehouse on her first morning, 62 pounds of coarse salt, the hickory Ethan had sent Skeeter to get from the woodcutter 2 miles up the road, Garrett stopped what he was doing and stared. "That what I think it is," he said to Doyle. Doyle, a quiet man in his 40s with a permanent sunburn and the habit of staying out of other people's business, just kept working. Garrett walked over to where Clara was unlocking the smokehouse door. "Ma'am," he said. Clara looked at him. "Yes, I just want to be real clear about something." He said it with the particular politeness of a man who had decided he was being reasonable. "That smokehouse hasn't been operational in 2 years. Getting it running before winter is serious work. There are techniques involved. It's not the kind of thing that someone like me can do," Clara said. He paused. "I wasn't going to put it that way." "But that's the thing you meant." He looked at her. She looked back at him. "I'll tell you what," Clara said pleasantly. "By end of the week I'll have a full batch of cured pork ready, properly smoked, properly preserved, enough to feed every person on this ranch for 3 weeks. She tilted her head slightly. "If I don't deliver that, you can tell Mr. Blackwood I wasted his time and his salt. Fair." Garrett looked at the smokehouse. He looked at her. He looked at the 62 pounds of coarse salt. He let out a slow breath through his nose. "I reckon we'll see." "Yes," Clara said. "We will." She stepped inside and closed the door. What she found inside the smokehouse when she finally had light and silence, and no one watching, was worse than she'd shown on her face when Ethan was with her. The contamination in the wood was deeper than she'd expected. 2 years of abandonment in a structure that hadn't been properly cleaned before it was shut meant that the interior walls had absorbed moisture and spoilage residue in a way that would need real work to correct. The fire pit had cracked along one edge. The ventilation gap was partially blocked by debris she couldn't see clearly yet, but could smell. But she'd seen worse. She'd seen worse in Tennessee when she was 14 years old, and the family operation had flooded, and everything had to be rebuilt from nearly nothing, and her father had stood in the ruined building with his hands on his hips and said, "Clara, look past what it is right now. Tell me what it's going to be." She pulled off her coat, rolled up her sleeves, and got to work. She started with the burn. She built a contained fire in the pit, controlled and deliberate, and let it run hot enough to char the interior walls without damaging the structure itself. The trick was temperature management hot enough to kill what lived in the contaminated wood. Not so hot you weakened the timbers. Her father had taught her that the fire had to be a tool, not a force. You used it. You didn't just set it loose. While the burn ran, she cleared the ventilation gap with a long-handled hook she found in the tool shed, pulling out compacted debris and dried leaves and one badly ruined bird's nest that must have been built in the spring and never disturbed since. By the end of the first day, the interior had been burned and was cooling. By the end of the second day, she had inspected every hook, replaced the bent ones with heavier gauge iron from the stock Ethan kept in the barn. She'd asked permission first, and he'd given it without questions, which she noted, and had the fire pit repaired with packed clay and stone that would need 12 hours to cure before she could use it for smoking. She slept 4 hours each of those 2 nights. Not because she was being stubborn about rest, because there was work that needed doing, and she was the only one there to do it. On the third morning, Skeeter appeared at the smokehouse door. He was maybe 20 years old, skinny with a gap between his front teeth, and an expression that suggested he was almost always on the verge of asking a question he wasn't sure was welcome. He held his hat in both hands. "Ma'am," he said. "Yes, Skeeter. I wanted to ask if you needed anything. Water hauled or anything." Clara looked at him. He was earnest in the way young men sometimes are before the world has had time to convince them not to be. "The salt needs to stay dry," she said. "I've got it covered, but if the weather turns overnight, I'd appreciate someone checking the tarp on the supply pile before first light." "I can do that," he said immediately. "Thank you." He started to leave. Then he turned back. "My grandmother cured her own pork," he said. "Back in Georgia. She said the smoke was the secret." "Your grandmother was right," Clara said. "A lot of women knew things that didn't get written down anywhere." He nodded like she'd said something important. Then he put his hat back on and left. It was on the 4th evening that Ethan came by. He didn't announce himself. She heard his boots on the frozen ground before the door opened, and she had already looked up from the fire by the time he stepped in. He stood just inside the doorway, taking in the changes, the repaired pit, the new hooks, the carefully stacked wood ready for the first real smoke run, and his face showed nothing. Though she'd started to understand that his face showing nothing was itself a kind of expression. "How's it coming?" he said. "First batch goes in tomorrow morning," Clara said. "The interior is clean, the pit is cured, and the temperature should hold right where I need it if the wind doesn't pick up overnight." He nodded slowly. He looked at the hooks. "Those aren't the original hooks." "No, I replaced them. I hope that's acceptable." "They look better than the originals." "They are. The originals were the wrong gauge for the cuts you're running. Heavier iron holds the load without bending." He was quiet for a moment. Not the silence of a man who had nothing to say. The silence of a man who was thinking before he spoke, which Clara had already begun to realize was just how he was. "You've been here 4 days," he said. "You haven't complained once." "I don't complain about work I agreed to do." "Most people do. Most people agree to work they don't want to do. I wanted this." He looked at her directly when she said that, like it had surprised him in a way he was taking seriously. "Why?" he said. Clara turned back to the fire and adjusted the airflow with a slight shift of the damper. "Because I'm good at it," she said simply. "And I haven't had a place to do it in long enough that I'd almost forgotten what it felt like." Ethan stood there for another moment. She thought he might say something else, but he didn't. He just nodded, once the kind of nod that means, "I heard you," and stepped back out into the dark. Clara listened to his boots on the frozen ground until they faded, and then she turned back to the fire. She was almost smiling. She didn't let herself examine why. The first batch of smoked pork came out of the smokehouse on the morning of the 6th day. Clara carried it herself. She didn't ask for help, and she didn't announce it was coming. She walked into the ranch kitchen and set it on the long table and stood back. The smell hit the room before the men's eyes fully registered what they were seeing. Garrett was the first one to stop moving. He stood with a coffee cup halfway to his mouth and looked at the cured meat on the table with an expression Clara had not seen on his face before. Something that wasn't his usual guarded assessment. Something that looked closer to genuine surprise than anything else. "That's," he started. "Hickory cured," Clara said. "Properly smoked, properly preserved. Enough to keep for 3 months if you store it right, which I'll show you how to do." Doyle walked over slowly and examined it the way a man examines something he wants to believe, but doesn't want to look foolish for believing. "It's real," he said quietly, almost to himself. Skeeter took a piece without asking permission, which Clara didn't mind, and chewed it slowly. His eyes got a little wide. "Ma'am," he said, "that's the best pork I've had since my grandmother's kitchen." Clara looked at Garrett. He set his coffee cup down. He looked at the meat. He looked at her. "I'll be honest with you," he said. "I didn't think you'd produce it." "I know. I said some things to Doyle about whether this was going to work. I know that too." He nodded slowly, the way a man nods when he's doing something uncomfortable and doing it anyway. "I was wrong," he said, "and I'm sorry for it." Clara looked at him for a moment, then she nodded. "Accepted," she said. "Now let me tell you what the second batch is going to require because we're behind on the timeline and Winter doesn't care about our schedule." Garrett pulled out a chair and sat down. Doyle sat beside him. Skeeter already had a pencil in his hand from somewhere. They listened. And Clara, for the first time in longer than she could easily measure, felt the particular satisfaction of being exactly where she was supposed to be. What she didn't see, because she was focused on the work, the way she was always focused on the work, was Ethan Blackwood standing in the doorway of the kitchen, watching all of it. He hadn't meant to stop. He'd been crossing from the barn to the main house, and the open kitchen door had caught him the smell, and then the sound of his men actually listening, leaning in, paying attention to someone at that table. He stood there long enough to watch Garrett apologize. He watched Clara accept it without gloating, without softening it into nothing, without making anything of it, except what it was. He thought about his wife, about Eleanor, who had been gone 3 years now, about how she had always said that the best kind of strong was the kind that didn't need to announce itself. He turned and walked back toward the barn before anyone saw him standing there. But something had shifted in his chest, small and quiet and difficult to name, and he carried it with him through the rest of the cold October day. The second batch was harder. Clara had known it would be. The first batch was proof of concept, a demonstration, a way of establishing that she knew what she was doing and that the smokehouse could function. The second batch was where the real work began, because now the expectations had shifted. Now people were watching. Garrett had stopped making remarks. That was something. But his silence wasn't the same thing as belief, and Clara knew the difference. A man who stops arguing with you isn't necessarily a man who's decided you're right. Sometimes he's just a man who's waiting to see if you fail on your own without his help. She wasn't going to fail, but she also wasn't naive enough to think the second batch would run as clean as the first. The first batch had been pork shoulder manageable weight, forgiving cuts relatively straightforward to hang and smoke. The second batch was going to include full-side cuts from the 2 additional hogs Ethan had slaughtered on the 7th day, and full-side cuts at that weight were a different conversation entirely. The hooks had to hold. The temperature had to stay consistent. The salt ratio had to be exact because a full-side cut that was undersalted at the start of the curing process would spoil from the inside before the smoke ever reached the center of the meat, and you wouldn't know it until you cut into it 3 weeks later, when there was nothing you could do about it. Clara spent the morning of the 7th day calculating salt ratios on a scrap of brown paper she'd found in the supply shed. She sat on an overturned crate just inside the smokehouse door, with the paper on her knee, and worked through the numbers the way her father had taught her, not by feel, not by approximation, but by weight and proportion, because curing was a science, even when people talked about it like it was art. She heard someone stop outside. "You figure something out by staring at a piece of paper like that," Garrett said. He wasn't being cruel. The edge was gone from his voice. He was asking an actual question, which was an improvement. "Salt ratios," Clara said without looking up. "Full-side cuts need a heavier cure than shoulder cuts. Get it wrong and you lose the batch." He was quiet for a moment. "How heavy?" "Approximately 1 pound of coarse salt per 8 pounds of meat, give or take depending on the fat content of the cut and how long we cure before smoking. I'm working out the specific numbers now because we can't afford to approximate with what we've got on hand." Another pause. She heard him shift his weight. "My uncle had a smokehouse," Garrett said, "back in Kentucky. He always said you couldn't teach curing. Said you either had the instinct for it or you didn't." "Your uncle was half right," Clara said. "The instinct helps. But the instinct without the knowledge will lose you a batch just as fast as no instinct at all. You need both." Garrett leaned against the doorframe. "Where'd you learn?" "My father." She said it simply the way you say something that doesn't need explanation because the weight of it is self-evident. He had an operation in eastern Tennessee, started small, built it up over 15 years. The knowledge passed down the same way it always does by standing next to someone who knows what they're doing and paying attention. "He's still running it." Clara looked down at her paper. "He passed 4 years ago." Garrett said nothing, which was the right call. Sometimes the right thing to say is nothing at all, and Clara had developed a respect for men who understood that. "I'll leave you to it," he said. "Garrett." She looked up. "I'm going to need someone to help hang the full-side cuts tomorrow morning. They're too heavy to manage alone on the upper hooks. I could use a pair of hands that won't argue with me about how to do it." He looked at her for a long moment. "I'll be here at first light," he said. Then he walked away. Clara went back to her paper and her numbers and the small, tight knot of tension she'd been carrying in her shoulders since the first morning on this ranch loosened just slightly for the first time. Ethan found her that same evening, not at the smokehouse this time, but at the edge of the property near the water trough, where she'd gone to wash the salt and ash off her hands before the temperature dropped below the point where water stayed liquid. She heard his boots and didn't turn around immediately, giving him a moment to decide whether he was going to speak or just nod and pass. He spoke. "Garrett told me you asked him for help tomorrow." "I did. He seemed..." Ethan paused. "He seemed less like himself than usual." "He apologized to me this morning," Clara said. "Properly. I think it cost him something, and he wasn't sure what to do with what came after." "That's about right," Ethan said. "Garrett has always been better at working through something than sitting with it once it's done." Clara dried her hands on the rough cloth she kept tucked in her coat pocket. "He's not a bad man. He was working with an assumption that had never been tested. Now it has been. Most people would still be angry." "Anger is expensive," Clara said. "I try not to spend it on things that have already resolved." Ethan stood beside her and looked out at the mountain line, where the last of the daylight was burning off the peaks in shades of orange that had nothing gentle about them. This was not gentle country. It had never pretended to be. "How far behind are we?" he said. "If the second batch goes as planned, we'll be about 2 weeks behind where I'd want to be for a ranch this size going into a Montana winter." She didn't soften it. He hadn't hired her to soften things. "That's recoverable. Barely. But it means the remaining batches have to run clean, and the weather has to give us the time we need. The weather doesn't usually cooperate this far into October." "No," Clara agreed. It doesn't. Another silence. This one was different from the early ones, the careful, measured silences of a man deciding how much to trust a stranger. This silence had a different texture. Like two people standing in the same place at the same time, actually standing there together instead of just occupying the same space. "Can I ask you something?" Ethan said. "You can ask." "When you walked into Garrison's store and took that advertisement off the post." He paused. "You didn't know anything about this ranch. You didn't know how bad things were. You just came. I knew what the advertisement said. I knew what the season was, and I knew what it meant that the position was still open 11 days after posting." Clara looked at him. A functional ranch with adequate resources would have filled that position in 2 days. The fact that it was still on the post told me the job was either harder than advertised or the man running the ranch was in worse shape than he wanted to admit. Ethan was very quiet. "And you still came," he said. "I still came," Clara said, "because harder than advertised is exactly what I was looking for. I don't do well with easy work, Mr. Blackwood. Easy work doesn't need me." He looked at her, then not the assessing, calculating look he'd given her that first day at the gate, but something more direct, more honest. "The ranch is in worse shape than I've told anyone," he said. It came out like something he'd been holding on to for a long time and had finally set down. "My wife managed the accounts, Eleanor. She had a way of seeing the whole picture at once the way some people can. When she died, I lost that. I've been running on what I could see in front of me and ignoring the parts I couldn't figure out. And this winter—" He stopped. "This winter you realized you'd run out of road to ignore," Clara said. "Yes." She let that sit for a moment. She didn't reach for it or rush to fill it. "The smokehouse is the beginning," she said finally. "Not the whole answer, but it's a beginning. Get the stores right and you get through the winter. Get through the winter and you have the spring to address the rest." Ethan nodded once slowly. "One thing at a time. One thing at a time." He started to turn toward the house. Then he stopped. "Eleanor would have liked you," he said. He didn't look at her when he said it. Just said it at the darkening mountain line, and then walked back toward the house. Clara stood at the water trough alone in the last of the daylight, and she let herself feel the weight of that sentence, what it meant from a man like him in a moment like this without running from it or analyzing it into something smaller than it was. Then she pulled her coat tighter and walked back to the smokehouse. There was still work to do. The morning of the full-side hang was cold enough that the breath of every person in the yard came out in white plumes and the frozen ground made a hard sound under every boot. Garrett was at the smokehouse door at first light, just like he'd said. So was Skeeter, who had apparently decided that where Garrett went, he went, which was either loyalty or habit, possibly both. Doyle arrived 7 minutes later carrying extra rope without being asked, which told Clara he'd thought about what the job was going to require and prepared accordingly. She made a mental note of that. Doyle was the kind of man who didn't talk much but paid attention, and in Clara's experience, men who paid attention were worth more than men who talked. "All right," she said. "Here's what we're doing." She walked them through it. The sequence, the spacing, the weight distribution. Why the upper hooks had to be loaded from the back forward and not front to back, what to watch for in terms of hook stress once the weight was on. She explained it clearly and without condescension, the way her father had explained things to her, as if the information was important and the person receiving it was capable of understanding it, both of which were true. Garrett listened with his arms crossed, but it was the crossed arms of concentration, not resistance. She'd learned to tell the difference. "Any questions?" she said. "What if the hook gives under the weight?" Skeeter asked. "It won't. I checked every one of them yesterday. But if something shifts, you'll feel it before it goes. There'll be a creak in the iron, not a snap. If you hear a creak, call out immediately, and we redistribute the load." "And if it goes fast," Doyle said, "step back and let it go. The meat can be rehung. A broken foot can't be unbroken." Doyle nodded. That was the kind of answer he respected. They got to work. The full side cuts were heavy, two of them pushing close to 110 pounds, and the process of lifting, maneuvering, and hanging them on the upper rack without letting the weight swing was the kind of work that required coordination and trust between people who were still, in most ways, strangers. Clara directed it. Garrett was on the primary lift, Skeeter on the guide, Doyle on the hook check. It went wrong in the 3rd minute. Not catastrophically, but it went wrong. The first cut came in at a slight angle, and the hook caught it off-center, and for approximately 3 seconds the full weight was hanging on a point that wasn't designed to bear it. Clara saw it happening. Before it happened, the angle was off. The swing was coming and she moved fast, putting her shoulder against the cut and correcting the angle while Garrett held the weight. "Back," she said sharply. Doyle, reseat the hook. Now. Not the outer edge, the center of the ring. Doyle had it done in 4 seconds. The cut settled onto the hook properly. Everyone breathed. Skeeter let out a long, slow breath that he'd apparently been holding since the moment Clara moved. "Lord Almighty," he said quietly. "That's why I told you to call out at the first creak," Clara said. She was breathing steady, but her heart was running fast, which she kept to herself. "We caught it. Nobody's hurt. Nothing's damaged. Let's do the second one." Garrett looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen from him before. Not admiration exactly, more like recalibration. The look of a man who has just watched someone move faster and cleaner than he expected and is updating his assessment accordingly. "You've done this before," he said, not a question. "Many times," Clara said. "Ready for the second cut." They did the second cut in half the time of the first one. By midday, the smokehouse was loaded, and the fire was running at the temperature Clara needed. She'd built it herself, selecting the wood, arranging it in the configuration that would produce the right smoke density at the right heat for the cuts hanging above, and she sat beside it now in the relative quiet, monitoring the temperature, the way a doctor monitors a patient, constant focused, ready to respond to any shift. Skeeter came by around noon with a tin plate. "Thought you might want to eat," he said. Clara looked at the plate. Salt pork and biscuits. She realized she hadn't eaten since before dawn. "Thank you," she said. He sat down on the supply crate near the door without asking, which she didn't mind. There was something about Skeeter that was easy to have nearby. He didn't demand attention or conversation, and he had a quality of stillness that belied his age. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "Go ahead. Why do you do it this way? Like, why not just—" He gestured vaguely. "Why not do it faster? Take shortcuts most people would." "Because shortcuts in curing mean the meat doesn't last," Clara said simply. "You can salt something fast and smoke it quick, and it'll look right when you cut into it the next day. But 3 weeks from now, when that's the only food between this ranch and starvation, it'll be green in the center. You can't rush the process. The process exists for a reason." Skeeter chewed on that for a moment, along with his own biscuit. "You think about that a lot, about what happens later." "I think about consequences," Clara said. "I was taught to think past the moment I'm in to the moment that comes after. Most problems are caused by people who stopped thinking at the immediate result." "My daddy always said, think before you act," Skeeter said. "Your daddy was right." She paused. "What happened to him? Fever took him when I was 12. He said it without performance, just the fact of it plain. "That's when I started working ranches." Clara looked at him. He was so young, and he'd been carrying something heavy for most of his life and had learned the way people who start carrying things young always learn how to make it look like nothing. "You're good at this work," she said. "You pay attention and you follow direction without needing to argue first. That's rarer than it sounds." He looked down at his boots, which was the Skeeter version of being moved. "Thank you, ma'am." "You don't need to call me ma'am. Clara is fine." He looked up surprised. "Mr. Blackwood." "Mr. Blackwood employs me. You're helping me. There's a difference." She held out her hand. "Clara." Skeeter shook it solemnly, like a man concluding a serious negotiation. "Yes, ma Clara." She almost smiled. Ethan wasn't in the house when she went to report on the batch at the end of the afternoon. Doyle told her he'd ridden out to the north pasture to check on the remaining cattle before the temperature dropped again. Clara nodded and turned to go, and then Doyle said quietly, almost to the wall, "He does that when something's bothering him. Rides out. Doesn't come back until he's worked through it." Clara turned back. "Does he do it often?" "More since Eleanor passed." Doyle kept his eyes on the knife he was cleaning, which was the Doyle version of having a personal conversation. "He's a man who does better with something in front of him to fix. When there's nothing in front of him, the things behind him get loud." Clara thought about that. What was she like Eleanor? Doyle considered this the way he considered everything, slowly and seriously, giving it the weight it deserved. "Steady," he said finally. "The kind of steady that makes everyone around it calmer, just by being there." She ran the accounts, kept the records managed, the part of the ranch that isn't cattle and fencing. The invisible part. He was quiet for a moment. When she went, it wasn't just that Ethan lost a wife. He lost the other half of what made this place work, and he's been trying to be both halves ever since, which no one man can do. Clara stood with this for a moment. "Thank you for telling me," she said. Doyle shrugged, which was his version of "you're welcome," and went back to his knife. Ethan came back from the north pasture at dusk, and she heard him in the barn settling his horse. She went to the smokehouse, checked the fire, adjusted the damper, and gave herself 10 minutes to just stand in the warmth of it, the smell of hickory and curing meat, and her own work surrounding her like something solid. She was still standing there when the barn door closed, and she heard his boots cross the yard. He knocked on the smokehouse door frame, which she appreciated. Most of the men had stopped knocking after the first few days, which was the kind of small thing that said something large about how they thought of the space. "Come in," she said. He stepped inside. He looked at the fire. He looked at the cuts hanging on the upper rack, all of them properly set, properly spaced, the smoke rising through them in the right density and color. He stood and looked at it for a moment with the expression of a man seeing something he had stopped letting himself hope for. "It's working," he said. "It's working," she confirmed. "Barring a significant temperature drop in the next 48 hours, we'll have a clean second batch. I'll need to start the third batch no later than day after tomorrow to stay on schedule." He nodded slowly. Then he said, "I heard what happened this morning, with the cut going off angle." Clara looked at him. "Garrett told you." Garrett told Doyle, and Doyle mentioned it. "It resolved without damage. That's not why I'm bringing it up." He looked at her directly. "You put your shoulder into a 100-pound cut to keep it from going. That's—" He paused. "That's not what most people would do. It's what needed doing. Clara." He said her name for the first time, and there was something slightly different in the way it landed in the room. Neither of them made anything of it explicitly, but neither of them pretended it was neutral either. "I'm saying thank you, for this morning and for all of it, the whole week." Clara was quiet for a moment. Receiving gratitude had never come naturally to her. She'd spent so many years in situations where the gratitude either didn't come at all or came wrapped in surprise. The kind of thank you that meant, "I didn't expect this from you," which wasn't really gratitude at all. This was different. "You're welcome," she said, plainly, meaning it. He looked at the fire. "Doyle tells me you talked to him today." "Briefly. He doesn't talk to most people." "I noticed. He told me—" Ethan stopped, started again. "He told me he thinks you understand what this place needs. He said that—" He said it in fewer words, but that was the meaning. Clara looked at the fire too. "Doyle is observant." "He is." A pause. "So is Garrett in his way. And Skeeter would follow you into a burning building at this point." "Skeeter is going to be a very good man," Clara said. "If someone takes the time." Ethan looked at her then, and there was something in his eyes that she couldn't fully read, or maybe she could, and she just wasn't ready to name it yet. "You're good with people," he said. "You don't seem to think you are, but you are." I grew up doing work that required cooperation, Clara said. You can't run a curing operation alone. You learn how people work or the whole thing falls apart. Is that all it is? Practical necessity? She looked at him. No, she said after a moment. I suppose it isn't. He nodded once, and then he did something she didn't expect. He sat down on the same overturned crate where she'd done her calculations that morning. He found it, pulled it over, and sat down beside the fire like a man who intended to stay for a few minutes. Not to supervise, not to inspect, just to sit, just to... Clara sat down on the low stool she'd been using for 3 days, and they sat together in the warmth of the smokehouse while the fire did its work, and neither of them said anything for several minutes. It wasn't awkward. That was the thing that struck her. A silence like that should have been awkward. Two people who were still mostly strangers, sitting in a small building in the dark, not talking. But it wasn't. It had the quality of something that had found its natural level. Tell me about Tennessee, Ethan said finally. Clara glanced at him. You don't have to, he added. I'm just asking. She looked back at the fire. My father built his operation from nothing. He came out of the war, the one before this generation's memory, and he had nothing left but what he knew. What he'd learned from his own father. And what he knew was how to preserve food for winter. She paused. He said once that keeping people fed through the cold months was the most important work a person could do, because everything else, everything beautiful and ambitious and worth living for, depended on people surviving until spring. Ethan was quiet. He sounds like a man who thought things through. He was. He thought about consequences. She smiled slightly privately. I apparently inherited that. How old were you when you started working alongside him? 7 for the small tasks. 9 when he started teaching me the real process. By 12 I could run a batch without his supervision. She was quiet for a moment. I spent 20 years learning everything he knew. And then I spent 4 years after he died watching people decide that knowledge didn't count for much because of what I looked like. She hadn't meant to say that last part quite so directly. It came out with more edge than she'd intended. Not anger exactly, but something honest that she didn't usually surface. Ethan didn't rush past it. Their loss, he said. Yes, Clara said. But it was also mine for a while. And now... She looked up at the cuts hanging in the perfect smoke at the hooks holding firm at the fire, running exactly where she needed it. Now, she said, it isn't. The trouble arrived 3 days later, and it didn't come from the smokehouse or the weather or anything Clara had been preparing against. It came from town. A man named Harlan Pruitt rode out to Blackwood Ranch on a gray Wednesday morning with 2 other men Clara didn't recognize, the kind of men who ride with someone as a statement rather than because they have anywhere particular to be. Harlan Pruitt owned the Pruitt Mercantile in Mill Haven and the Pruitt boarding house, and from what Clara had gathered from Skeeter's casual conversation, approximately half of the outstanding debts in the valley. He was a man built for indoor spaces, soft-featured in the way of men who ate well when others didn't, and he arrived at the Blackwood gate with the particular air of a person who had come to do something unpleasant and had decided to enjoy it. Clara was at the smokehouse. She heard the horses and looked out through the gap in the door. Ethan came out of the main house to meet Pruitt at the fence. She couldn't hear the conversation at first, the distance was too great, but she could read it. She'd grown up watching men talk money, and money conversations had a posture to them that was unmistakable. The way Pruitt held himself. The way Ethan went still. Garrett appeared at her shoulder. She hadn't heard him come up. Pruitt, he said, his voice flat and unreadable. Who is he? He holds the note on about 40% of this ranch. Garrett's jaw was tight. Ethan took out a loan after Eleanor passed. Equipment failure, bad season medical debts from when she was sick. Pruitt stepped in. A pause. Pruitt always steps in. Clara watched. Pruitt was talking, gesturing with the kind of expansive, generous motion that meant he was delivering bad news and wanted to look magnanimous while doing it. Ethan wasn't moving. His arms were at his sides. His posture was rigid, and Clara knew that posture. She'd seen it on her father when the bank came. The posture of a man receiving something he's not surprised by, but hasn't fully accepted yet. One of the men who'd ridden with Pruitt leaned over from his horse and said something that made Pruitt smile. Ethan didn't respond to whatever it was. "What's Pruitt after?" Clara said. Garrett was quiet for a long moment. "There's a payment due at the end of the month, for the note. Ethan's been telling Pruitt for 2 months that the winter stores would be ready in time, that he'd have something to sell before the deadline. And Pruitt doesn't believe it. Pruitt has been waiting for a reason to call the note. A man like Pruitt doesn't make loans to help people. He makes loans to create leverage." Garrett's voice held a controlled fury that Clara recognized as the anger of someone who'd been watching an injustice happen slowly over a long time without being able to stop it. If the stores aren't ready, he can argue the ranch isn't viable. If the ranch isn't viable, the note comes due in full. And if the note comes due in full, Ethan loses the ranch, Clara said. Yes. She looked at the smokehouse door, at the smoke rising from the chimney, at the work inside that had been proceeding exactly as planned for 10 days now. "How much does he need?" she said. "Enough that the stores matter. Enough that having a full smokehouse before the deadline changes the numbers." Garrett looked at her. "Why do you think he advertised for someone to run the smokehouse? It wasn't just about food. It was about having something to show." Clara processed this. Across the yard, Pruitt laughed at something. It was the laugh of a man who was relaxed because he held all the cards and the man across from him knew it. Ethan said something short and quiet. Pruitt's laugh faded. He looked at Ethan with a different expression, now not the relaxed amusement of a man in control, but something more calculating, more interested. Pruitt looked toward the smokehouse. Clara stepped back slightly from the gap in the door. "What did Ethan just say?" she said. Garrett was watching the same thing she was. "I don't know," he said. But Pruitt stopped laughing. Pruitt said something to his men. Then he looked toward the smokehouse for another moment, and then he turned his horse and rode back out through the gate. The 2 men followed. Ethan stood at the fence for a moment after they left. Then he turned and walked toward the smokehouse. Garrett stepped back from the door, giving Clara the space to open it. She opened it. Ethan stopped in front of her. He looked exhausted in a way she hadn't seen from him before. Not the functional exhaustion of physical work, but the deeper kind that comes from carrying something heavy for too long without anyone to set it down with. "How much did you hear?" he said. "Not the words," Clara said, "but enough." He looked at her steadily. "I owe you the truth. I should have told you before now." "You told me what you could," Clara said. "When you were ready. The note is due in 18 days. He said it directly the way he said everything once he'd decided to say it at all. "If I can demonstrate the ranch has viable winter stores enough to get through to spring without buying food, then I have an argument for the extension. Without that, Pruitt calls it." "Yes." Clara was quiet for a moment. She looked at the fire. She looked at the cuts on the upper rack. She looked at the schedule she'd been running in her head, the one that said if everything went according to plan, they would have full winter stores complete with 8 days to spare. 8 days. That was not a comfortable margin. But it was a margin. 18 days, she said. "Yes." "Are there other batches ready to slaughter? I can have 3 more hogs by the end of the week, 2 more sides of beef if I move them up." Clara did the calculation in her head, not on paper this time. In her head, where it ran clean and fast the way it always had. "If the weather holds," she said, "and if I push the schedule not cut, we can have full stores with 4 or 5 days before the deadline." Ethan looked at her. "That's not much room." "No," she said. "But it's room." She met his eyes. "I don't need comfortable room, Mr. Blackwood. I need enough to work with." Something crossed his face. It wasn't quite relief. It was too layered for that, too mixed with everything else he was carrying. But it was something. "I'll move up the slaughter schedule," he said. "And I'll move up the smoking schedule," Clara said. "Tell Garrett, we'll need to start the 3rd batch tomorrow instead of the day after." He nodded. He started to turn away. Then he stopped. "Clara." He turned back and looked at her, and this time there was nothing measured or careful in the way he was looking at her. Just direct and honest, and a little raw around the edges, the way things look when a person has put down a weight they've been pretending not to carry. "I'm glad you came." Clara held his gaze. "So am I," she said. He turned and walked back toward the house, and Garrett, who had moved far enough away to be decent, but not so far that he'd missed anything, looked over at Clara with an expression that said quietly, and without commentary, that he'd just watched something important happen and had the good sense not to remark on it. Clara turned back to the fire. 18 days. She had everything she needed: the knowledge, the tools. The people beside her who had, against the initial odds, become something closer to a team than a skeptical audience. What she didn't have was weather insurance. And as she stood beside the fire and felt the particular stillness in the cold air outside, the kind of stillness that wasn't peace, but pressure, the kind that came before a storm made up its mind, she understood with the instinct her father had given her, and the knowledge she'd built on top of it, that the weather was about to stop cooperating. She added another piece of wood to the fire. One thing at a time. The storm announced itself the way every dangerous thing in Montana announced itself, not loudly, but unmistakably, if you knew how to listen. Clara knew how to listen. She'd felt it in the air 2 days before the sky confirmed it. A change in the pressure. A particular quality of silence from the mountains, like the whole range, was holding its breath before exhaling something enormous. Her father had taught her to read weather through her body, before she ever learned to read it through instruments, the way cold air felt different at your wrists than at your face when a front was coming. The way smoke from a cured fire rose straight in stable air and began to drift and curl hours before a storm arrived. By the time Skeeter came running to the smokehouse on the morning of the 12th day, shouting that the sky to the northwest had gone the color of a fresh bruise, Clara already had 3 additional logs ready at the side of the fire pit and her coat buttoned to the top. "I see it," she said before he could finish the sentence. Skeeter stopped in the doorway, breathing hard from running. "Mr. Blackwood says it could be a bad one. Says the cattle need to be moved to the south shelter before—" "Go help Garrett with the cattle," Clara said. "I'll manage the smokehouse." "Clara, you can't." He caught himself, reconsidered. "How long can you hold the temperature if the storm knocks the wind around?" It was the right question. She'd been calculating the answer since the moment she'd felt the pressure change 2 days ago. If the storm hits from the northwest, which it will, the building will take the brunt on the chimney side. That'll create a draw issue. The smoke pulls wrong, and the temperature drops. She kept her voice level, because there was no benefit to panic, only to precision. "I can compensate for about 4 degrees of temperature loss with manual fire management. Anything beyond that, and the batch is at risk. What can I do before I go to the cattle? Get me Doyle. He doesn't need to be here all night, but I need him for the first 2 hours to help manage the wood if the draw shifts." Skeeter was already gone before she finished the sentence. Doyle appeared 7 minutes later. He didn't say anything when he came in. He looked at the fire, looked at the cuts on the rack, looked at Clara, and nodded once. That was Doyle's entire communication of, "I'm here, tell me what you need, let's get through this." "Thank you," Clara said. "Don't thank me yet," Doyle said. "Let's see what the storm does first." What the storm did, it turned out, was arrive 3 hours earlier than anyone had calculated, and hit harder than even the pessimistic estimates. Clara heard it before it reached the building, a sound like the whole mountain was moving, not dramatically, not with the theatrical violence of a summer thunderstorm, but with the deep methodical weight of something that had been building for days and had finally arrived at its destination. The wind hit the smokehouse from the northwest exactly as she'd predicted, and within 45 seconds of the first gust, she felt the fire respond. The draw shifted. "Here," she said to Doyle, and she moved to the left side of the pit, while he moved to the right, and they worked in the practiced silence of 2 people doing something that required coordination and couldn't afford misunderstanding. She adjusted the primary damper. He added wood on the windward side to compensate for the heat loss. She monitored the smoke color lighter than she wanted, which meant the temperature was dropping, and added a specific configuration of hickory that her father had shown her for exactly this situation: seasoned wood on the inside, a green piece on the outside edge to create a slower, steadier burn that held temperature against wind interference. The temperature steadied, not where she wanted it, but steady. "Hold there," she said quietly to the fire as much as to Doyle. Doyle added another piece of wood on his side, without being asked at exactly the right moment and the right position, which told her his instincts were better than he let on. "You've done this before," she said. "My father had a smokehouse," he said, not looking up from the fire. "Before the war." Something about the way he said "before the war" meant she didn't ask which war. That particular wait was its own answer. They worked steadily for the next hour and a half, and the storm got worse before it stopped getting worse. The temperature inside the smokehouse dropped twice more, once sharply enough that Clara felt the cold in her bones despite the fire. And each time she and Doyle corrected it with the focused efficiency of people who understood that there was no margin for anything less. Outside, she could hear the ranch responding to the storm. Men's voices, the sound of cattle being moved, hooves on frozen ground. At one point she heard what sounded like a fence section going the particular crack and drag of split rail giving way under wind load, and she heard Garrett's voice rise sharp and commanding and then go about the work of the problem. The smokehouse held. At the 2-hour mark, Doyle straightened up from the fire and looked at the temperature, which had stabilized into an acceptable range and was holding. "You've got it," he said. "I've got it," Clara confirmed. He looked at the cuts on the rack. He looked at the fire. He said, "My father would have hired you on the spot." Clara looked at him. "That might be the nicest thing anyone has said to me since I got here." "Don't tell Skeeter," Doyle said. "He'll be crushed." He picked up his hat, which he'd set on the supply crate when he came in, and walked out into the storm without another word. By the time midnight arrived, Clara was alone. The storm had settled into the kind of sustained heavy cold that didn't rage, but simply pressed, the kind that found every gap in a structure and occupied it, that worked its way into the joints of buildings and the joints of bodies with equal patience. The ranch had gone quiet outside, which meant everyone had done what they could and retreated to warmth and sleep. Clara stayed, not because she couldn't have left. The fire was stable. The temperature was holding. A trained person could have slept 3 hours and come back and manage the adjustment. But this was the batch that determined the margin. This was the smoke running on the final cuts that pushed the total stores from adequate to sufficient, and sufficient was the word that stood between Ethan Blackwood and Harlan Pruitt's satisfied smile. She was not going to sleep on sufficient. She fed the fire at careful intervals. She monitored the smoke. She sat beside the heat with her back against the stone wall of the smokehouse, and her eyes on the cut of meat on the upper rack that had given her the most concern. The heavy one, the one that had come in slightly thick on the far side, and needed more time to absorb the cure evenly. She watched it the way you watch something that can't tell you what it needs, but will show you if you pay close enough attention. Around 2 in the morning, the wind changed direction. Not much. 7 degrees, maybe 10. But a shift in wind direction around a smokehouse fire in a storm was not a small thing. It changed the draw, changed the smoke distribution, and if it happened fast enough, it could create a backdraft situation that would spike the temperature in the pit to a level that threatened the cuts above. Clara was already moving when it happened. She had the damper adjusted in 4 seconds. She pulled 2 pieces of wood from the front of the fire with the iron tongs, her hands absolutely sure and steady despite the cold, and repositioned them to redirect the burn away from the area where a backdraft would concentrate. The temperature in the pit spiked for exactly 8 seconds. Then it dropped back. Then it found its level. Clara stood over the fire with the iron tongs still in her hands, breathing through the near miss, and she thought about her father standing in the ruined building after the flood with his hands on his hips saying, "Look past what it is right now and tell me what it's going to be." She set the tongs down. "Fine," she said aloud to no one. To the storm, to the fire, to the memory of her father and the work he'd given her, and the long road from eastern Tennessee to a smokehouse in Montana in the middle of the night, with everything on the line, and no one watching. "We're fine." She sat back down. She didn't sleep. Ethan found her at first light. The storm had broken sometime before dawn. She'd heard it break, felt the pressure change in the direction of relief rather than accumulation. And the silence that came after was the particular clean silence of a world that had just been rearranged. She heard his boots crossing the yard with the particular purposeful rhythm of a man who had woken up worried and was going directly to the source of the worry. He knocked on the doorframe. "Come in," she said. He came in. He stopped when he saw her sitting on the stool beside the fire soot on her coat sleeves, eyes that hadn't slept in 22 hours, and behind her, the smokehouse full and intact, and the temperature exactly where she'd set it before the storm hit. He stood very still for a moment. "You stayed all night," he said. "The wind shifted around too," Clara said. "The draw changed twice. I needed to be here." He looked at the cuts on the rack, at the fire, at the color of the smoke, the right color, the right density, exactly what it needed to be. Then he looked back at her with an expression that she couldn't put a simple name to because it was too many things at once. "Are you all right?" he said. "I'm tired," she said, "and I need coffee." "I'll get you coffee." "Ethan?" She said his name because he was already turning, and she needed him to hear this first. He turned back. "The batch is clean. Everything held. We're going to make your deadline." He looked at her for a long moment, and she saw something move through his face that he didn't try to hide from her relief, so deep it looked almost like pain. The way relief does when you've been bracing against something for so long that letting it go hurts on the way out. "All of it," he said. "The whole batch, all of it." She managed a slight smile despite the exhaustion. "Your upper rack held. Not a single hook gave way." He let out a long, slow breath. He turned toward the door. Then he turned back again, which was something she'd noticed he did when he had something to say that he was still deciding whether to say. "When I came out here this morning," he said, "I was afraid I'd find the fire down and the batch lost, and—" He stopped. "I told myself on the way across the yard that if that happened, it wasn't your fault, that the storm was no one's fault, that I'd—" He stopped again. "I'm telling you this badly." "You're telling me you were prepared to let me off the hook," Clara said. He looked at her steadily. "I'm telling you that when I walked in here and saw you still here, still at the fire after a night like that, and the smokehouse standing and the batch running clean." He held her gaze. "I don't have the right words for what that meant." Clara held his gaze right back. "You have 6 days left on the deadline," she said finally, gently redirecting them both to the ground they were standing on. "Let me sleep 3 hours, then I'll show you what we've got." "3 hours," he said. "I'll have coffee and food ready when you wake up." She nodded. He turned and left. Clara looked at the fire one more time, at the work that had held through a Montana storm at the smokehouse, that her father's knowledge had kept running through a night that could have ended everything. And then she closed her eyes just for a moment and let herself feel it. Not pride exactly, something more private than pride. The particular satisfaction of a person who has done what they were put on this earth to do in the place where it mattered most exactly when it was needed. Then she stood up, adjusted the damper one final time, and walked across the frozen yard to the main house. She woke up 3 hours later to the smell of coffee and the sound of voices in the kitchen that stopped the moment she came through the door. Garrett, Doyle, and Skeeter were all there. They looked at her with expressions that ranged from Skeeter's unguarded relief to Doyle's quiet acknowledgement to Garrett's face, which had rearranged itself into something that Clara had come to recognize over the past 2 weeks as his version of genuine respect. Not the easy surface kind, but the harder kind that had been earned against his own resistance. Ethan was at the stove. He turned when she came in and handed her a cup of coffee without a word, which was the exactly right thing to do. She drank half of it before she said anything. "Fence section went down," she said to Garrett. "Got it up before dawn," Garrett said. East section near the water trough. Skeeter and I said it before the temperature dropped again. Lost 2 fence posts on the north side, Doyle added. Not structural. Can be repaired today. Clara nodded. The smokehouse needs a damper check this afternoon once I'm back. The storm stressed the mechanism, and I want to make sure it's running clean before the next check cycle. I'll do it with you, Garrett said. She looked at him. He said it the way a man says something when it's not an offer, but a statement, the way you say, I'm coming with you, rather than can I come. Good, she said. Ethan set a plate in front of her. She looked up at him. Sit down, she said. You don't need to serve me. You stayed up all night saving my ranch, he said. I think I can make you breakfast. The kitchen went slightly quiet in the way of rooms full of people who are all politely pretending not to notice something that everyone has noticed. Ethan, Garrett said, with the particular tone of a man deciding to say something that might be none of his business, but he was going to say it anyway. Pruitt's going to come back. Ethan sat down at this table. I know. He rode back through town yesterday while the storm was hitting. Talked to some people at Garrison's. Told them. Garrett paused. He was choosing his words, which meant the words he wasn't choosing were worse. He told some people that the Blackwood operation was being run by a woman who wouldn't know a proper cure from a kitchen roast. The kitchen went very still. Skeeter's jaw tightened. Doyle looked at the wall. Clara set her coffee cup down slowly. He said that in public, she said. In the store. With an audience. Garrett's voice was controlled, in the way of a man keeping a shorter temper on a long leash. He said Ethan had gotten desperate enough to hand the smokehouse over to someone with. And I am repeating this exactly as I heard it, because I think you deserve the exact words, more enthusiasm than ability, and more body than sense. The silence after that was the kind that has weight. Ethan was looking at the table. His jaw was set hard. Skeeter, who was 20 years old and had not yet fully learned the art of strategic silence, said, I'd like to tell that man exactly. Skeeter, Clara said quietly. He stopped. Clara picked up her coffee cup again. She was quiet for a moment, letting the anger move through her and find its level, because anger that wasn't managed became a liability, and she could not afford a liability right now. Here's what Harlan Pruitt's opinion tells me, she said finally. It tells me he's worried. A man who was confident he was going to win doesn't bother talking in public about the person standing between him and what he wants. He's had someone watching this ranch. He knows we're further along than he expected. Garrett looked at her. Something shifted in his expression. That's you might be right. Of course she's right, Doyle said to the wall. He's trying to undermine the confidence before the deadline, Clara continued. If people in town believe the stores aren't legitimate, it makes it easier for him to argue they aren't viable, even after they're done. He's building a narrative. She paused. Which means we need to build a better one. Ethan had been listening to all of this with his eyes on the table. Now he looked up. What are you saying? He said. I'm saying that when those stores are complete, when we have everything on those shelves that this ranch needs to get through the winter, I want an inventory. A written, documented, specific inventory with weights and dates and process notes. Something that can be put in front of anyone who has questions about what was done and how. She looked around the table. Pruitt can say whatever he wants about who I am. He can't argue with documented weight and legitimate cure. Nobody spoke for a moment. Then Skeeter said with considerable feeling, That's real smart, Clara. It's what my father would have done, she said simply. Garrett looked at Ethan. She's right. Documentation changes it from a word fight to a record fight. Pruitt can win a word fight. He can't win a record fight. Ethan looked at Clara. Can you keep those records? I've been keeping them since I arrived, Clara said. I have weight logs, temperature records, and process notes for every batch we've run. She paused. I do that on every job. It's standard practice. I just didn't know I was going to need to use them against someone. Ethan stared at her. You have 11 days of documentation, Clara said, in the supply shed on brown paper with dates. Another silence. Doyle let out a sound that might have been a laugh. It was hard to tell with Doyle, he kept that close to the chest. Garrett said with the quiet satisfaction of someone watching a chess game resolve 3 moves early. Pruitt doesn't know about the records. No, Clara said. He doesn't. Ethan looked at her with the expression she'd come to think of as his reassessing expression. The one that appeared when she'd done something that required him to update the picture he'd been building. He'd had it several times over the past 2 weeks. Each time, it came with a quality of something that went beyond professional evaluation into something more personal, something she noticed and deliberately did not push on. After breakfast, he said. I want to see those records. After breakfast, Clara agreed. You'll have them. They went through the records together at the kitchen table, just the 2 of them, the other men having drifted back to the morning's work with the tactful awareness of people who understood when a room needed fewer people in it. Clara spread the brown paper pages across the table and walked him through them methodically. The dates, the weights, the temperature logs, the notes on the smoke runs. She talked about the process the same way she always talked about it, with the particular fluency of someone explaining something they've spent their life understanding. And Ethan listened with his full attention in the way that was particular to him. Not passive listening. The kind where someone waits for you to stop talking, but active listening. The kind where you can feel the person taking in what you're saying and doing something with it. He asked good questions, not obvious questions, not questions designed to show he was paying attention. Specific questions about the temperature management during the storm, about why the documentation covered weight before and after cure, about the process notes on the hickory selection. You chose 2 different hickory batches, he said, pointing to a notation on the 3rd day's record. Different sources. The first supply Skeeter got from the woodcutter was good, but cut recently 3 months seasoned, not 6. I used it for the initial burn and the temperature work, but not for the primary smoke runs. 6 days into our operation, I found a cache of properly seasoned wood in the back of your tool shed. Ethan looked up. I didn't know that was there. Neither did Garrett or Doyle. Skeeter found it when he was helping me move the salt. Clara pointed to a note in the margin of 1 page. I documented which wood was used for which batch because the smoke profile is different. If someone knowledgeable examines the cured product, they can taste the difference in the smoke quality. The later batches will be noticeably better because of the properly seasoned wood. Ethan sat back from the table. He looked at the papers spread across it. At 11 days of careful, detailed, honest documentation of work, done exactly right, methodically recorded by a woman who had apparently prepared for scrutiny she hadn't even known was coming. Clara, he said. She looked at him. I owe you an honest statement, he said. All right. He was quiet for a moment, organizing what he wanted to say into something accurate. When I hired you, I was desperate. I told myself I was giving you a fair chance, but the truth is, I gave you a chance because I had no other option, and I expected it to not quite work out. And I had prepared myself for the conversation where I'd have to tell you it wasn't working and figure out something else. He paused. I want you to know that. Not because it reflects well on me, it doesn't, but because I think you deserve the honesty of where I actually started from. Clara was quiet. I know, she said. You knew. From the first day at the gate, yes. She wasn't unkind about it, just direct. A man hiring out of genuine confidence doesn't stand in his own doorway and list the reasons why the job is hard. You were covering your uncertainty with information, which is what people do when they've made a decision they're not sure about and want to give themselves an exit route. Ethan looked at her steadily. That's an uncomfortably accurate reading. I've been read that way too many times myself, Clara said. I know what it looks like. A pause. I'm not uncertain anymore, he said. I know that too, Clara said quietly. The kitchen was very still. Outside, she could hear Skeeter calling something to Garrett across the yard, and the sound of tools on frozen ground, and the ordinary morning sounds of a ranch that was alive and working. The sounds of something that was going to survive. Ethan gathered the brown paper pages into a careful stack and looked at them. I'm going to ride into town, he said. I'm going to show these to Emmett Walsh at the assay office. He's an honest man, and he knows livestock and provisions. If he signs off on the records, Pruitt can't argue. The documentation is self-serving." Clara nodded. "That's a good idea. Will you—" He stopped, reconsidered the phrasing. "I'd like you to come, if you're willing." She looked at him. "To town," he said. "To meet Walsh. He'll have questions about the process, and you can answer them better than I can." Clara was quiet for a moment. She understood what he was asking beyond the practical request. He was asking her to walk into Millhaven, the town where the merchant had watched her take that advertisement off the post where Harlan Pruitt had stood in a store and said those words about her in front of an audience, and stand alongside Ethan Blackwood as someone whose work had value and whose name meant something. "When do you want to leave?" she said. "Hour," he said. "If you're ready." "I'll be ready," Clara said. They rode into Millhaven side by side, which was itself a statement, though neither of them said so. Clara sat straight on the borrowed horse, which she'd told Ethan she could handle before he could ask, and she had handled it without difficulty, which was a thing Ethan filed away in the same place he'd been filing everything she did that adjusted his understanding of who she was. The main road of Millhaven wasn't busy at that hour, but it wasn't empty either, and the people who saw them come in registered the sight of Ethan Blackwood riding beside a woman they mostly remembered from 11 days ago, when she'd walked in from the cold and pulled an advertisement off the post. Clara kept her eyes forward. Emmett Walsh ran the assay office out of a narrow building between the barber shop and the harness maker, and he was the kind of man who looked like he'd been assembled for the purpose of being credible. Square-set, direct-eyed gray at the temples, with the careful, deliberate manner of someone who had spent decades evaluating things with precision and had no patience for imprecision in himself or anyone else. He shook Ethan's hand. He looked at Clara with the assessing look of a man performing his function, rather than passing a social judgment, which was already an improvement on most of the looks she'd gotten in this town. "Miss Whitmore," he said. "Mr. Walsh," she said. Ethan laid the records on Walsh's desk without preamble. "I need an independent evaluation of these. What was done, how it was done, whether it was done correctly." Walsh sat down and put on his reading glasses. He read. The room was quiet while he read. Clara watched him work through the pages, his eyes moving with the particular focused movement of a man who actually comprehended what he was reading rather than scanning it, and she made herself stay still and let the records speak, because that was what records were for. Walsh looked up at one point and said directly to Clara, "The temperature variance notation on day 9, the storm night, you're indicating a drop of approximately 6 degrees in the pit temperature and recovery within 11 minutes. How? Repositioning the primary fuel load away from the windward draw area and adjusting the secondary damper to create a controlled pressure differential," Clara said. "The fire finds its own equilibrium if you give it the correct conditions. You don't force a fire. You manage its environment and let it respond." Walsh looked at her for a moment. "Where did you learn that specific technique?" "My father. It was his standard response to draw interference. He told me he'd learned it from his father, who'd learned it in Virginia before the First War." Walsh looked back at the records. He read 2 more pages. "3 generations of knowledge," he said almost to himself. "At least," Clara said. Walsh set the records down. He took off his glasses and looked at Ethan. "These are legitimate," he said. "The documentation is thorough. The process described is correct, and the notes demonstrate an expert-level understanding of the curing process. Whoever questions these records in front of me is going to lose the argument." Ethan exhaled slowly. Walsh looked at Clara. "Miss Whitmore, I'm going to say something that is not my business, and you can tell me so if you'd like." "Say it," Clara said. "Harlan Pruitt was in this office yesterday afternoon," Walsh said. "He told me, and I am quoting him here, that the Blackwood Smokehouse operation was being managed by a woman of questionable capability and obvious desperation. He suggested that any stores produced under those conditions would not meet the standard of legitimate winter provision under the terms of the outstanding note." The room was absolutely still. Clara looked at Walsh steadily. "And what did you tell him?" "I told him I hadn't inspected the operation and couldn't comment." Walsh looked at the records on his desk. "I can comment now." He looked up at both of them. "I'll put my signature on these records. If Pruitt wants to contest the legitimacy of the Blackwood stores, he'll be contesting the assay office's evaluation, and I'd be interested to watch him try." Ethan reached across the desk and shook Walsh's hand with a grip that communicated everything he wasn't saying. Walsh looked at Clara. "You've got 4 days left on the deadline as I understand it." 4 days, Clara confirmed. "The stores will be complete in 2. Walsh almost smiled, which on his face was a significant event. "Then I suspect Harlan Pruitt is going to have a very disappointing end of month." They came out of the assay office into the cold of Millhaven's main street, and the first person Clara saw was the woman in the green dress, the one who had watched her take the advertisement off the post 11 days ago, with the particular expression of someone watching a dog try to open a gate. The woman was standing across the street with another woman Clara didn't recognize, and both of them were watching Clara and Ethan come out of the assay office, with expressions that had evolved considerably from 11 days ago. Clara looked at them. She didn't look away. She didn't look down. The woman in the green dress, after a moment, nodded. It was a small thing, barely a gesture. But it was a nod, not a stare. And that was the distance between 11 days ago and now, and Clara felt the size of that distance in her chest. She walked to her horse and mounted without assistance. Ethan mounted beside her. "Pruitt's going to hear about Walsh signing the records," he said. "Yes," Clara said. "He is. He'll move his next step up. He won't wait for the deadline now." "I know." Clara looked at the road ahead. "That's fine. Let him move. We'll be ready." Ethan looked at her sidelong the way he'd developed the habit of looking at her when he was taking her measure against something new. "You're not afraid of him." "I'm not afraid of a man whose only real power is other people's uncertainty," Clara said. "Remove the uncertainty, and Pruitt has nothing." She paused. "Walsh just removed a significant portion of the uncertainty. Pruitt knows it. He's not going to let it go," Ethan said. "No," Clara agreed. "He's not." She met Ethan's eyes. And the thing that passed between them in that moment wasn't dramatic, wasn't the sweeping certainty of people who have made declarations. It was quieter and more solid than that. The particular thing that exists between two people who have stood in the same storm and come out the other side of it still standing, still looking at each other. "Then we finish the stores," Ethan said. "We finish the stores," Clara said. They rode back toward Blackwood Ranch in the cold October light, and by the time they reached the split-rail fence with the black gate, the last of the afternoon was burning off the mountains, in that way that Montana had, beautiful and indifferent and absolutely certain about what was coming next. Clara dismounted at the gate and walked directly to the smokehouse. She had 2 days. She had the knowledge. She had the records. She had Walsh's signature and Doyle's steady presence and Garrett's converted respect and Skeeter's uncomplicated faith. What she didn't have was certainty about what Pruitt was going to do next, because Walsh was right, and she was right, and Pruitt knew it, and men who knew they were losing had a way of changing the game when they couldn't win the one they'd started. Clara opened the smokehouse door and walked into the warmth of the fire. She added a piece of seasoned hickory to the pit. Whatever Pruitt was planning, he was going to find the stores complete the record signed, and the woman he'd dismissed in the most public way available, standing on the other side of every argument he brought. She had 2 days. She intended to use every hour of them. The last 2 days ran like a controlled burn, deliberate, focused, consuming everything that wasn't essential and leaving only what mattered. Clara didn't sleep more than 4 hours on either night. Not because she was being reckless about her own limits, but because the final batches required the kind of attention that couldn't be delegated and couldn't be rushed, and she had made a promise not out loud, not to anyone who could hold her to it, but a promise to herself that the stores would be complete and correct and beyond any reasonable challenge before Harlan Pruitt showed his face at the gate again. Garrett stayed late on the first of those 2 nights. He didn't announce it. He just didn't leave when Doyle and Skeeter went in at dark. He found the second stool in the corner of the smokehouse, the one Clara had never seen anyone use, and he pulled it over to the side of the fire pit and sat down with a cup of coffee he'd brought from the house and didn't say anything for a long time. Clara didn't tell him to go. After a while, he said, "How'd you know about the salt ratios, the specific amounts?" "My father kept journals," Clara said. 20 years of them. Every batch he ever ran. The weights, the ratios, the wood, the temperatures, the results. When he died, those journals were the most valuable thing he owned. She paused, adjusting the damper a fraction. "I read every page twice before I left Tennessee." Garrett was quiet. "You brought them with you." "I have them memorized," she said. He looked at her. All of them. Every table he put down, every notation. She looked at the fire. "He knew I'd need them. He knew before I did that I was going to end up somewhere that wouldn't have a shelf full of reference books for me to consult. So he made sure I could carry what I needed in my head." Garrett sat with that for a while. "My father taught me cattle," he said eventually. "I know how to look at a herd and tell you which animals are going to make the winter and which ones are already costing you more than they're worth. I can read a steer the way you read that fire." "I know," Clara said. "I've watched you with the herd. You're very good." He looked slightly surprised. Not uncomfortable exactly, but unused to it, the specific expression of a man who doesn't receive straightforward professional acknowledgement very often and isn't sure what to do with it when he does. "Ethan said you don't give compliments, you don't mean," he said. Clara glanced at him. "He said that at supper 2 nights ago. Doyle asked him what he thought about how the operation was running, and Ethan said—" Garrett paused, making sure he had it right. "He said Clara doesn't say things to make people feel good. When she tells you something is right, it's right." Another pause. "I thought you should know he said it." Clara looked back at the fire. She didn't say anything for a moment. The fire did what a good fire does, held steady, gave light, asked nothing back. "Thank you for telling me," she said. "Seemed like the kind of thing a person ought to hear," Garrett said. They sat together in the warmth of the smokehouse, while the Montana night pressed cold against the walls, and there was a quality to the silence between them that had traveled a considerable distance from the morning when he'd stood in the smokehouse doorway and told her the work was too demanding for someone like her. People Clara had always believed were capable of more change than they usually got credit for. You just had to give them the right conditions and enough time. Same principle as the fire. The stores were complete on the morning of the 14th day. Clara knew it before she opened the smokehouse door and walked the shelves in the gray pre-dawn light, touching each packaged cut with the assessing hand of someone who had done this her entire life. She knew it by weight and smell, and the particular firmness of properly cured meat that had been smoked at the right temperature for the right duration with the right wood. But she walked the shelves anyway, because documentation required verification, and verification required the physical act of checking, and she was not the kind of person who declared something done based on feeling alone when she could confirm it with her hands. She counted, she weighed, she cross-referenced against the records. Then she went to the main house and knocked on the kitchen door. Ethan opened it. He was already dressed, which meant he'd been awake for a while. He looked at her face, and his expression shifted into something alert and very still. "It's done," Clara said. He held the door open wider. She walked in. The kitchen filled up fast after that. Skeeter appeared from somewhere, almost immediately, with the uncanny timing he had for significant moments, followed by Doyle, who must have heard the knock from the bunkhouse. Garrett came last from outside, where he'd apparently been since first light, doing exactly what Clara had been doing, checking and rechecking the things in his domain, making sure everything that was supposed to be in order was in order before the day took whatever shape it was going to take. They stood around the kitchen table, and Clara laid the completed records on the wood. The full 14 days of documentation, every batch, every weight, every temperature, reading every notation, and said, "The stores are complete. Total cured weight is 467 pounds of pork and 212 pounds of beef, documented by batch, by date, by process, and countersigned with Walsh's independent verification on the primary records. Nobody said anything for a moment. Then Skeeter said very quietly, "Lord Almighty." Garrett looked at the records with the expression of a man looking at something he hadn't believed was possible 467 pounds ago. His jaw worked slightly. He looked up at Clara and said, "You did it." "We did it," Clara said. "Those cuts don't hang themselves." Something moved across Garrett's face that was the most unguarded thing she'd seen from him. He looked down at his boots for a second, looked back up. "Yes, ma'am," he said quietly. "I suppose we did." Ethan was looking at the records. He hadn't picked them up. He was just looking at them on the table, at the physical evidence of 14 days of work that stood between everything his family had built and the man who wanted to take it. His jaw was tight in the way it got tight when he was holding something he wasn't ready to say yet. Clara looked at him. "You have 2 days before the deadline," she said. "More than enough time to get these in front of the right people." Ethan looked up from the records and directly at her. "He's going to come here," he said. "Pruitt. He's not going to let it end with records at the assay office. That's not how he operates." "I know," Clara said. "Let him come." Pruitt came that same afternoon. This time, he didn't bring 2 men. He brought 4, which was itself a statement, the kind a man makes when he knows the ground has shifted under him and wants to suggest that his weight alone can re-level it. 3 of them Clara didn't recognize. The 4th was a man named Deschamps, who apparently had some kind of official capacity that Pruitt was using like a prop. Though Garrett told her in a low voice as the horses came through the gate that Deschamps' official capacity was considerably less solid than Pruitt liked to present it. Ethan went out to this gate. This time, Clara went with him. Pruitt pulled his horse up at the fence and looked at both of them. Something moved across his face when he saw Clara standing alongside Ethan. A calculation, a rapid reassessment of the scene he'd been expecting versus the one he'd arrived at. He covered it with the wide, smooth expression of a man who had made a career out of not showing when he was surprised. "Blackwood," he said. "Pruitt," Ethan said. Pruitt's eyes moved to Clara. He looked at her the way he'd described her in Garrison's store, with the particular dismissiveness of a man who had decided what something was worth before examining it. "I see you've still got your arrangement here." "Miss Whitmore manages the smokehouse operation," Ethan said. His voice was perfectly level. "As I believe you're aware." "I am aware," Pruitt said pleasantly. "That's partly what I'm here to discuss. Blackwood, the terms of your note require demonstration of viable winter stores as assessed by—" "Walsh has already assessed them," Clara said. Pruitt looked at her. He'd been planning to talk over her, or through her, or past her. She could see it in the way he'd started the sentence angled toward Ethan. Her voice landed in the middle of it like a stone dropped in a still pool, and the ripples went in all directions. "I beg your pardon," he said. "Emmett Walsh at the assay office has reviewed and countersigned the operation records," Clara said. 14 days of documentation covering every batch, every weight, every process specification. Independently verified. She looked at him with the particular calm of someone holding all the cards and not needing to fan them out dramatically to make the point. "If you'd like to dispute Walsh's evaluation, you're welcome to take it up with him directly." Pruitt looked at Ethan. "Walsh doesn't have the authority to—" "Walsh has exactly the authority required under the terms of the note," Ethan said, and Clara heard something in his voice she hadn't heard before. Not the controlled, measured steadiness of a man managing his anger, but the clean, unencumbered tone of a man who was no longer afraid. "I had the document reviewed. His evaluation satisfies the provision." Pruitt's pleasant expression developed a hairline crack. Deschamps leaned down from his horse and said something to Pruitt in a low voice. Pruitt's jaw tightened. "I'd like to see the stores myself," Pruitt said. "Inspect the smokehouse, personally." "No," Ethan said. The word landed like a dropped hammer. Clean, flat, final. Pruitt's eyes went sharp. "Blackwood, you have Walsh's signed evaluation," Ethan said. That satisfies the note terms. The smokehouse is private property, and my records have been independently verified. There's no provision in the note that gives you the right to enter my property for a personal inspection, and we both know it. Pruitt looked at Clara. Really looked at her this time, not with the dismissive scan he'd given her before, but with the calculating look of a man trying to find the weak point in an argument, and finding, to his considerable displeasure, that there wasn't one. "You put her up to this," he said to Ethan. "The records. Walsh. All of it." "She put herself up to it," Ethan said. "I just gave her the smokehouse key and got out of the way." It was the wrong thing to say if the goal was to make Pruitt feel better, and it was exactly the right thing to say if the goal was accuracy, and Clara felt something move through her chest at the words, something warm and solid and entirely unexpected, that she managed to keep off her face, because this was not the moment for it. Pruitt gathered himself. He looked at Ethan with the expression of a man recalculating strategy in real time. "The payment is still due at the end of the month," he said. "Records or no records." "The payment will be made," Ethan said. "Will it?" "It will." Pruitt looked between them. He looked at the smokehouse chimney from which a faint thread of smoke still rose, the residual heat of a fire that had completed its work, but hadn't fully cooled yet. He looked at the four men with him, who were doing what men do when they've ridden somewhere for a confrontation that hasn't gone the way they were told it would go. They were sitting on their horses and waiting. "You've had one good month," Pruitt said. The pleasantness was almost entirely gone from his voice now. "One season. One woman with a salt barrel and a fire." He paused deliberately. "That doesn't make a ranch viable, Blackwood. That makes a ranch lucky, and luck runs out." Ethan looked at him without expression. "Are we done here, Harlan?" Pruitt pulled his horse's head around. He didn't say goodbye. He rode back out through the gate with his four men behind him, and the sound of the hooves on frozen ground faded down the creek road until the air was clear and cold and entirely without Harlan Pruitt in it. Nobody moved for a moment. Then Skeeter, who had been standing 20 feet back near the barn and had apparently been there for the entire exchange, said, "Did he just leave?" "He left," Garrett said from the other side of the fence post where he'd apparently been stationed in case of a different kind of trouble. Doyle appeared from somewhere Clara hadn't expected and stood beside her, and the five of them stood at the gate in the aftermath of the confrontation, and the thing Clara felt in that moment was not triumph exactly. It was something quieter. The satisfaction of a correctly run process that had produced the correct result. The relief of a structure that had held under weight because it had been built right. Ethan turned and looked at her. "He'll be back," she said, because she believed it, and he deserved to know she believed it. "I know," Ethan said, "but not today." He paused. "And not with the same argument." Clara nodded. "Not with the same argument." What happened next happened fast, and it came from a direction none of them had been watching. 2 hours after Pruitt rode away, a woman named Margaret Holt arrived at the Blackwood Gate alone on a gray mare, which was notable because Margaret Holt was Millhaven's postmistress and had, in Clara's limited experience of the town, never been known to ride anywhere unaccompanied. She was 60 years old and iron-spined in the way of women who have managed other people's information for decades and developed strong opinions about what deserved to be said aloud and what didn't. She asked for Clara specifically. That was the first surprise. The second surprise was what she said when Clara came out to the gate. "I was at Garrison's store this morning when Pruitt came back from here," Margaret said without preamble, which Clara had already decided she appreciated. "He said some things." "What things?" Clara said. "He told Garrison and 2 other men that the Blackwood operation was fraudulent, that the records Walsh signed were—" She paused, choosing her words carefully. "He implied they were produced after the fact, not contemporaneous documentation, that Walsh had been taken in." Clara felt the cold of the air more sharply than she had a moment before. Not fear, not anger. Something more immediate and more technical than either the recognition of a specific threat that required a specific response. "He's calling the records fabricated," Clara said. "He's implying it," Margaret said. Carefully. Pruitt doesn't say things he can be held to. He says things that create impressions. Can Walsh defend the evaluation? Walsh can defend anything, Margaret said. But Pruitt isn't going after Walsh directly. He's going after the timeline. He's telling people the records couldn't possibly be contemporaneous because... She stopped. Because no one believed I could produce legitimate results in the time given, Clara said. Margaret looked at her steadily. Yes. Clara was quiet for exactly 4 seconds. Then she said, "Do you have a moment to come in?" "I do," Margaret said. They sat at the kitchen table, Clara and Margaret and Ethan, while Garrett and Doyle stood near the door in the way of men who have decided this conversation is their business, even if they haven't been invited into it. Clara put the records on the table. Not the summary records she'd shown Ethan. The full working documents, the original brown paper sheets she'd written on from the first day. Some of them stained with wood smoke. Some with salt residue. One with a water ring from the coffee cup she'd set down on it the morning after the storm. Margaret picked them up and read them. She was slow about it, careful the way a postmistress is careful with documents she's been asked to assess reading, not just the content, but the physical object, the condition of the paper, the quality of the handwriting under different circumstances. "These were written over time," Margaret said. "Every day," Clara confirmed. "You can see the handwriting changes steadier on the early days when I wasn't fatigued, different on the storm night." She pointed to the 9th day's entry, which she'd written at 2:30 in the morning, with cold hands by firelight. "That's not the handwriting of someone reconstructing events. That's the handwriting of someone who is exhausted and cold and doing what she does every day because it's a habit." Margaret looked at the pages. She looked at Clara. "Do you know what a contemporaneous document looks like to someone who's spent 40 years receiving letters?" she said. "Tell me," Clara said. "It looks like this," Margaret said. She set the pages down on the table with the deliberate, measured movement of a woman who has made a decision and is communicating it through action. "Pruitt is a fool if he thinks he can challenge these in front of anyone who knows what real records look like." Ethan leaned forward. "Can you say that in public if it comes to that?" Margaret looked at him, the way women of 60 look at men who ask obvious questions. "Ethan Blackwood, I have been vouching for documents in this town for longer than you've owned this ranch. If Harlan Pruitt wants to stand up in front of the valley and tell people these records are fake, I will stand next to Walsh and tell people precisely the opposite, and we'll see who this community has more faith in." Garrett from the doorway said, "Ma'am, that might be the most useful thing I've heard this month." Margaret gave him a look that wasn't unfriendly. "I know what Pruitt is," she said. "I've been watching him build his position in this valley for 15 years. He does it the same way every time. He creates uncertainty, and then he fills the uncertainty with his own version of events." She looked at Clara. "You have the documentation. You have Walsh. Now you have me. Pruitt's version requires people to believe that Walsh was deceived, and that these records were manufactured by a woman who arrived in this valley 2 weeks ago with a travel bag and walked 6 miles in October cold for a job nobody else wanted." She paused. "The people of Millhaven are not as a general matter that foolish." Clara looked at her. "You came all the way out here to tell me that." "I came all the way out here," Margaret said, "because I was at Garrison's store the morning you walked in and took that advertisement off the post. I watched how they looked at you. I watched how you held yourself." She folded her hands on the table. "I didn't say anything then because I didn't know yet what you were going to do. I know now." She stood up. "So I'm saying something now." She put her hat back on, nodded at Ethan, nodded at Clara, and walked out of the kitchen with the brisk certainty of a woman who had done the thing she came to do and had other things waiting. The kitchen was quiet after she left. Skeeter, who had apparently been standing in the hallway the entire time, appeared in the doorway with an expression of barely contained emotion. Did she just—" "Yes," Clara said. That's... "Yes, Skeeter," Garrett said. "We know." Metric Day. The end of the month arrived the way all deadlines arrive, faster than you're ready for, and with a clarity that no amount of preparation can fully soften. The payment was due on a Thursday. By Tuesday, the Valley knew about Walsh's evaluation, Margaret Holt's endorsement, and the fact that Blackwood Ranch was carrying 467 pounds of properly cured pork and 212 pounds of beef into the winter numbers that had moved through Millhaven with the speed and specificity of information that people find genuinely surprising and therefore genuinely worth repeating. By Wednesday, 2 other ranchers had come to the gate. The first was a man named Aldous Crane, who ran a modest spread 3 miles north and had, according to Garrett, been watching the Blackwood situation with the careful attention of someone who understood that what happened to one ranch in a valley sent a message to every ranch in the valley. He rode in without his hat on, which Clara later learned was his particular signal that he was arriving in peace rather than on business, and he stood in the yard and looked at the smokehouse chimney and said, "I heard what you did here, the whole operation, start to finish." "Most of what you heard is probably accurate," Clara said. "I heard about the storm night," Aldous said, "about you staying at the fire. The batch needed watching." Aldous looked at her with the look of a man making an assessment he intends to act on. "My smokehouse has been closed 3 years," he said. "I've been buying from Pruitt's provision supply at his prices." He paused. "I'd like to talk to you about whether you'd consider, after the work here is settled, taking a look at what I've got." Clara looked at Ethan. Ethan was standing 6 feet away and had heard all of it. His expression was carefully neutral in the specific way it got when something was happening that mattered more than he wanted to show on his face. "I'd be willing to discuss it," Clara said. The second rancher, a woman named Ruth Calloway, who ran her own place since her husband had died 2 seasons back, came an hour after Aldous left. She didn't ask about the smokehouse. She asked to speak with Clara alone. They walked to the fence line, just the 2 of them. Ruth Calloway was perhaps 50, weathered in the specific way of women who have done the work of 2 people without acknowledgement for years. And there was something in her eyes that Clara recognized from her own mirror in bad seasons. "I want to know how you did it," Ruth said. "Not the smoking. I know smoking. I mean how you walked into a place where nobody wanted you and made yourself necessary." Clara looked at the mountains. "I found the work that needed doing and I did it," she said. "I didn't try to make them want me. I just made sure I was useful enough that they couldn't afford not to." Ruth was quiet. "It sounds simple when you say it." "It wasn't," Clara said. "But the principle is simple. You don't ask for a place at the table. You show up with something the table needs." Ruth nodded slowly. Then she said with the careful deliberateness of someone asking something they've been working up to, "Do you think a woman can run a ranch alone without a man's name attached to it?" Clara looked at her directly. "I think a woman can run anything she understands well enough. And I think most people discover that faster than they expected once they stop waiting for permission." Ruth looked at her for a long moment. "Thank you," she said. She didn't explain what she was thanking her for. She didn't need to. Hi. Thursday morning arrived cold and clear in the specific way of October mornings that intend to be honest with you. Pruitt showed up at 9 o'clock with Deschamps and 2 men Clara had seen before, the same 2 who'd ridden with him the first day. No additional numbers this time. That was interesting. A man who adds numbers when he's confident and reduces them when he isn't. Ethan met him at the gate alone. Clara stood at the smokehouse door. The conversation lasted 8 minutes. She counted. She watched Pruitt's posture through the whole of it. The expansive confidence of the first visit. The controlled frustration of the second visit. And now something different. Something she'd seen before in people who had decided to cut their losses, but needed to do it in a way that preserved the appearance of choice. Ethan handed Pruitt an envelope. Pruitt opened it. Read whatever was inside. His jaw moved. He folded the paper, put it back, and said something Clara couldn't hear. Ethan said one short sentence in response. Pruitt looked at the smokehouse. At Clara. She held his gaze from 40 feet away with the same steady attention she gave to a fire that was trying to go wrong, watching it, not reacting, just watching. Pruitt turned his horse and rode out. Ethan stood at the gate for a moment after the sound of hooves had faded. Then he turned and walked toward Clara with the deliberate pace of a man who has just set down the heaviest thing he's been carrying and isn't yet entirely sure how to walk without it. He stopped in front of her. "It's done," he said. "What was in the envelope?" she said. "Payment in full," he said. "Not just this month's installment, the full remaining balance on the note." Clara stared at him. "How?" He let out a long breath. Aldous Crane, and two other men who had outstanding notes with Pruitt and had been watching the situation. He shook his head slightly. "Crane came to me last night after he left here. Said if I could deliver the full balance by morning, he and the others would back it collectively as a private loan terms set by me, no leverage, no conditions. Said they were tired of watching Pruitt pick apart the valley one note at a time." Clara felt the shape of this sink in, not just the payment. What it represented people in the valley choosing collectively to place their weight on a different side of the balance than Pruitt had been counting on. "Aldous did that because of the stores," she said. "He did it because of you," Ethan said. He said, he paused. He said a woman who stayed at a fire all night in a Montana storm to protect someone else's livelihood was the kind of person he trusted with his money. He looked at her steadily. He wasn't wrong. Clara looked at the smokehouse. At the chimney where the smoke had thinned to almost nothing now that the work was complete. At the building that had been a ruin 3 weeks ago and was now full of winter stores and signed documentation, and the evidence of what happened when you gave someone the right conditions and enough time. "Garrett," she said. He appeared from beside the barn like he'd been there the whole time, which he probably had. "Yeah, go get Doyle and Skeeter. I think this warrants a proper meal." Garrett looked at her. Something in his face broke open in the way hard things sometimes do when the pressure that's been holding them together finally lifts. He put his hand briefly on the fence post, the way men sometimes touch something solid when they're feeling something they're not going to say out loud. "Yes, ma'am," he said, and went. The meal that evening was the best one the Blackwood Ranch kitchen had produced in longer than anyone was willing to admit, and it was made from the stores the pork cured and smoked over 14 days of hard work and expertise, and nights that had cost more than they looked like from the outside. They ate at the long table, and nobody was formal about it. Garrett told a story about the fence section going in the storm that was funnier in retrospect than it had been in the moment. And Skeeter laughed until he knocked his coffee cup over, and then looked mortified until everyone else laughed too. And Doyle made one dry remark that brought the table down in a way that nobody had expected from him. And the evening had the particular warmth of people who have come through something together and are allowing themselves finally to feel the relief of the other side. Ethan was quiet through most of it. Not the closed-off quiet of the man Clara had met at the gate 3 weeks ago, but a different kind, the quiet of a man who is fully present in a moment and wants to take it in without distraction. After the meal, after Garrett and Doyle and Skeeter had gone out to finish the evening's work, with the lightness of men who have had a weight lifted, Clara began clearing the table. Ethan stayed. He picked up his coffee cup and didn't move toward the door. "Clara," he said. She looked at him. "Aldous Crane is going to ask you about his smokehouse," he said. "I know. And Ruth Calloway is going to ask you something too, if I read her right." "She already has," Clara said, in a manner of speaking. Ethan set his coffee down on the table. He was looking at it, not at her, in the particular way of a man organizing something he wants to say correctly before he says it. "I don't want you to take those jobs," he said. Clara went very still. He looked up. "Not because I have any right to tell you what to do," he said immediately. "I know I don't. Not because I think you can't do them or they don't need doing. They do." He paused. "I'm saying it because I want to ask you something else. And I want to ask it before someone else makes you a different offer that you might feel obligated to take out of the same instinct you showed up here with. The one where you go where you're needed and do the thing that needs doing and then prepare to move on." Clara looked at him. "I was prepared to move on," she said carefully, "when the work here was done." "I know," Ethan said. "That's why I'm saying this now." He stood up from the table. He reached into his coat pocket and produced something she hadn't expected, a folded piece of paper which he set on the table and pushed toward her. She picked it up and unfolded it. It was a legal document, simple but specific. Her name was on it, so was his, and the words had a weight to them that made her read them twice before she let herself understand what she was reading. It was a partnership agreement, not an employment contract, not a hired hand arrangement, or a seasonal position, or a temporary arrangement dressed up with formal language. A partnership, her name on the Blackwood operation, equal share in the smokehouse and its production, legal standing on the property. She looked up at him. "I had Walsh draw it up," Ethan said. "2 days ago, before Pruitt came, before the payment, before any of it was settled. Because I didn't want it to look like I was doing it because I owed you something." He held her gaze. "I'm doing it because you belong here. Because this ranch needs what you know and what you are, and because—" He stopped, started again. "Because I have not felt like this land was fully alive since Eleanor died, and 3 weeks ago a woman came through my gate with a travel bag and an argument about hook gauges, and she didn't ask me to feel anything. She just did the work. And something came back into this house that I had stopped believing was coming back." Clara stood at the other side of the table with the document in her hands and looked at Ethan Blackwood, at the man who had handed her a key 3 weeks ago with doubtful eyes and rigid pride, and who was standing in front of her now with nothing held back and nothing left to hide behind. She thought about these 6 miles she'd walked in October cold, about the merchant's careful eyes, and the way Garrett had crossed his arms, and the way Pruitt had said enthusiasm over ability in a room full of people who laughed. She thought about every place she'd been before this one, where the work had been good, but the ground had never fully held her weight. She thought about what her father had said about surviving until spring. She looked down at the document. Then she looked up at Ethan. "This makes us partners," she said. "Yes," he said. "In the ranch. In the ranch. In the operation. In—" He held her gaze. "In whatever comes next." Clara was quiet for a long moment. She set the document back on the table. She picked up a pencil from the shelf behind her, the one she'd been using for records for 3 weeks. The same one that had written 14 days of documentation, that had beaten Harlan Pruitt and brought Aldous Crane and moved Margaret Holt out of the post office and onto the road. And she signed her name to the bottom of the document with the same steady hand she used for everything that mattered. She set the pencil down. She looked at Ethan. "Well then," she said, "I suppose I should tell Aldous Crane I'm not available." Something broke open across Ethan Blackwood's face that she had never seen there before. Not the careful neutrality of a man managing his expression, or the measured steadiness of a man managing his life. Something real and unmanaged, and utterly unguarded. He reached across the table and picked up the document, and his hand was not quite steady as he folded it. "I'll put the coffee on," he said. His voice had a roughness to it that hadn't been there before. "It's going to be a cold night." "It's Montana," Clara said. "They're all cold nights." "Yes," Ethan said. "But this one's different." She didn't argue with that. Because he was right. The first snow came on a Friday. Clara knew it was coming before she looked out the window. She felt it in the air the same way she felt everything important, through the particular quality of the cold. The way it changed from the dry bite of October into something heavier, something with weight and intent. She was in the smokehouse, running a final temperature check on the supplemental batch they'd started after the payment had cleared, when the first flakes came through the ventilation gap and landed on the back of her hand. She looked at them. Let them melt. Then she adjusted the damper, checked the temperature one more time, and walked out into the first snowfall of the Blackwood Ranch's winter. It was beautiful in the way Montana was always beautiful, without asking permission, and without caring whether you were ready. Skeeter was already outside. He was standing in the yard, with his head tilted back and his mouth open like a child catching snowflakes on his tongue, which was exactly the kind of thing Skeeter did that made it impossible to have a bad day in his vicinity. He heard her come out and straightened up immediately, which would have been more convincing if he hadn't still been grinning. "First snow," he said. "I noticed," Clara said. "You think it'll be a bad winter?" Clara looked at the sky, at the particular density of the clouds and the weight of the snow coming down. "It'll be a full winter," she said. "Not a disaster, but not mild. "Good thing we've got the stores," Skeeter said. And then with the kind of uncomplicated satisfaction that was entirely his, "Good thing we've got you." Clara looked at him. He meant it the way young people mean things when they haven't yet learned to say them sideways directly, completely, without the complicated overlay of people who have been hurt enough to hedge everything they feel. "Go check the cattle shelter," she said. "The north side door has been sticking." He pulled his hat down against the snow and went, still grinning. Garrett found her an hour later at the fence line, where she was inspecting the east section he and Skeeter had repaired after the storm. He came up beside her and stood looking at the same stretch of fence without speaking, which was his way of joining a conversation without making a production of it. "Holding," she said about the fence. "For now," he said. "I'll reinforce the corner post before the heavy snow comes." She nodded. They stood there for a moment in the light snowfall, with the particular comfortable silence of people who have worked alongside each other long enough that silence doesn't need to be filled. "Clara," Garrett said. I've been at this ranch 4 years." He kept his eyes on the fence. "I've worked with a lot of people in that time. Good ones and bad ones and ones that were somewhere in the middle." He paused. "I've never worked with anyone like you." Clara looked at him sideways. "Is that good or bad?" Something pulled at the corner of his mouth. "I said it while I was still trying to decide, but I've decided now." He turned to look at her directly, and his eyes were serious in the way they got when he was being fully honest with no performance in it. "It's the best thing I can say about a person." Clara held his gaze for a moment. "You're a good cattleman, Garrett, and you're a better man than you were the morning you stood in that smokehouse door." He looked down at his boots, the same way he'd done the first time she'd complimented him, the look of a man who wasn't used to receiving something honestly and was figuring out how to hold it. "Ethan says the same thing," he said, "that I'm better." "Ethan's right." Garrett put his hat more firmly on his head against the snow. "He's also the most different I've seen him since Eleanor passed," he said quietly. "And that's got your name on it, too." He walked back toward the barn before she could respond, which she suspected was intentional. Clara turned back to the fence. The snow was picking up. The mountains behind the ranch had disappeared into the gray-white of the storm, and what was left was the immediate world: the fence, the yard, the smokehouse chimney with its thin thread of smoke, the main house with the light on in the kitchen. She stood in it for a long moment. She had signed a piece of paper 3 days ago that put her name on this land. She was still getting used to the weight of that. Ethan came to the smokehouse that evening. She heard him before she saw him. His particular footstep on the frozen ground, the one she'd learned to distinguish from Garrett's heavier stride and Doyle's measured pace, and Skeeter's quick, uneven walk. She had learned all of them without meaning to. She had learned a great many things about this ranch and the people on it without meaning to. That was what happened when you paid attention. The world gave you back what you put into it. He knocked on the doorframe. "Come in," she said. He stepped inside and the warmth of the fire wrapped around him the way it always did. The smokehouse had that quality, the particular welcome of a place where heat had been maintained with care over a long period of time. He stood for a moment and just let it be around him. "The snow's settling," he said. "I know. Temperature will drop tonight, maybe significantly. The stores are insulated. I checked the back shelving yesterday and reinforced the cold side wall with the extra batting from the supply shed. They'll be fine." He looked at her. "I'm not worried about the stores." She looked back at him. "I'm asking how you are," he said. It was such a simple thing. The kind of simple thing that shouldn't have the power to stop a person in their tracks. But Clara had spent enough seasons in places where no one thought to ask it, that the question landed differently than it would have on someone who had always heard it regularly. She looked at the fire. "I'm good," she said. And then, because he deserved more than the functional answer, "I'm better than I've been in a long time." Ethan nodded slowly. He sat down on the stool beside the fire, the stool that had become over the past 3 weeks, quietly, and without declaration his stool. The one he sat on in the evenings when he came by, and they talked about the ranch, or didn't talk at all, whichever the moment called for. "Aldous Crane sent a message today," he said. "I heard. Skeeter mentioned it. He wants to discuss the smokehouse operation in the spring, not hiring you away. He understood what I told him about the partnership, but potentially a consulting arrangement. Come over for a week, assess what he has, set him up with a plan." Clara considered this. That could work. Ruth Calloway sent a message too. Also Skeeter. He's a remarkable information distribution system. The corner of Ethan's mouth moved. She wants the same. A consultation. Not ongoing work, just getting her started. Getting her smokehouse functional. "I could do that in a day," Clara said. "Maybe 2. "I know you could." He looked at the fire. "I told them both I'd pass the messages along, and the decision was yours." Clara looked at him. "You didn't say yes or no for me. It's your work," Ethan said simply. "Your expertise, your time. I wouldn't presume." He paused. "The partnership doesn't mean I own your judgment." Clara was quiet for a moment. "What does it mean to you?" He looked at her directly. "It means I don't want to run this ranch without you in it. It means when I think about next spring and next fall and the winter after this one, you're in that picture, and I don't want to think about it any other way." He paused. "And it means I want to ask you in the spring when the ground is less frozen, and the circumstances are less—" He gestured around at the smokehouse, the fire, the accumulated weight of everything the last 3 weeks had been. "Less everything. I want to ask you something. A different kind of question than a partnership agreement." Clara looked at him for a long moment. "All right," she said softly. "All right, you'll wait. All right. I hear what you're saying." He held her gaze. "Is that enough for now?" "It's enough for now," she said. And they sat together beside the fire while the snow came down outside, and the ranch settled into the quiet of a winter that had been prepared for, truly prepared for, maybe for the first time in too long, and neither of them needed to say anything else. But the trouble with Pruitt wasn't finished. Clara had known that since the day he rode away from the gate without goodbye. Men like Pruitt didn't finish when they left. They went away and regrouped and came back in a different shape, and the mistake was thinking that winning one confrontation was the same as winning the thing. He came back on a Tuesday. Not to the ranch. He didn't come to the ranch this time. He went to Walsh. Clara found out from Margaret Holt, who sent word through Skeeter. She had apparently decided that Skeeter was the most reliable communication route in the valley, which showed excellent judgment that Pruitt had been to the assay office with a lawyer from Helena, a man named Coates, who apparently specialized in exactly the kind of careful technical legal challenges that didn't announce themselves as attacks until they'd already done the damage. They were challenging the basis of Walsh's evaluation, not the records directly, something more subtle. They were challenging Walsh's standing to evaluate a curing operation under the specific language of the note provision, arguing that the assessment required someone with a certified livestock provision background rather than a general assay function. Clara sat with this for approximately 4 minutes after Skeeter delivered the message. Then she put on her coat and told Ethan she was going to town. "I'll ride with you," he said. "You don't need to." "Clara." He said her name the way he said it when he meant it as a statement and not just an address. "I'll ride with you." She looked at him for a second. "Fine," she said. "Keep up." Gord. Walsh was at his desk when they came in, and he had the expression of a man who had been working through a problem for several hours and had not yet found the solution to it, but had not stopped looking. He looked up when they came in, and something in his face settled slightly, which Clara took as information. "You heard," he said. "I heard," Clara said. "Tell me the exact language of the provision." Walsh found the document. He read the relevant section aloud. Clara listened with her full attention in the way she listened to everything that mattered, not just for the surface meaning, but for the specific words, the construction, what they included, and what they didn't. She asked him to read it again. He read it again. Then she said, The provision requires assessment by a person with, and I'm going to quote this, established knowledge of livestock provision and preservation methods. It doesn't specify certification. It doesn't specify official capacity. It requires established knowledge. Walsh looked at the document. Back at her. That's the correct reading. Pruitt's lawyer is going to argue that established knowledge requires a credential. That's what he argued this morning, Walsh confirmed. And what does established knowledge actually mean in this valley? Clara said. In practical terms. In the terms that the men who wrote that kind of provision in this kind of region would have meant when they used that phrase. Walsh took off his reading glasses. He looked at her steadily. Ethan, who had been standing just inside the doorway, said nothing. He was watching Clara work the way Clara had watched the firework with focused attention and the intelligence to stay out of the way of something that was doing exactly what it needed to do. It means someone who has demonstrated knowledge through practice, Walsh said slowly, not through paper. How long have you been evaluating provisions in this valley? Clara said. 31 years. And in 31 years, how many times has a credential been required for that assessment function? Walsh was quiet. How many times, Walsh? She said gently. Never, he said. Because it's not required, Clara said. Because the language was written to capture real expertise, not paper expertise. Because in 1857, in Montana, territory paper expertise in livestock provision barely existed. The men who knew how to keep cattle and people alive through a Montana winter learned it from their fathers and their fathers' fathers, and the law recognized that. Walsh looked at the document for a long moment. Coates is going to argue that contemporary standards, he started. Coates is a Helena lawyer who has never spent a Montana winter, Clara said. He can argue contemporary standards. We'll argue the provision as written the 31 years of precedent in this valley, and, she paused, and the fact that the person whose expertise he's questioning has 14 days of documentation proving results that any certified provisioner in this territory would recognize as expert-level work. Walsh looked at Ethan. Ethan said from the doorway, what she said. Walsh let out a long breath through his nose. He picked up his pen. I'm going to write a formal statement, he said, specifying the basis of my evaluation, the applicable standard, and the 31 years of precedent. He looked at Clara. And I'm going to attach your documentation, all of it. 14 days every page. Do you need them? I have them here. Clara reached into her coat and produced the folded brown paper pages she'd brought without announcing she was bringing them because preparation was a habit that didn't require explanation. Walsh looked at the pages, then at her. Then he did something she had not seen from him before. He shook his head very slightly, not in refusal, but in something that looked a great deal like wonder. Sit down, Miss Whitmore, he said. This is going to take an hour. I'd like you to walk me through the process one more time so I can notate correctly. Clara sat down. Take all the time you need, she said. Coates, the Helena lawyer, left Millhaven on Thursday morning without having achieved anything except a bill that Pruitt was going to have to pay. Margaret Holt was the one who saw him go. She sent word through Skeeter. The message was brief, which was very. Margaret, he's gone. Walsh's statement stands. Tell Clara, the Valley says thank you. Skeeter read it aloud in the kitchen at breakfast, and when he got to the last sentence, his voice went slightly unsteady, in the way of 20-year-olds who are feeling something large in a small body, and he covered it by immediately taking a very large bite of biscuit. Garrett poured his coffee and said, About time. Which was Garrett, for I'm deeply relieved and also pleased, and I'm not going to say either of those things directly. Doyle said nothing, which was Doyle for everything. Ethan looked at Clara across the table. She looked back at him. He picked up his coffee cup. She picked up hers. It wasn't a toast. It wasn't a declaration. It was two people at a kitchen table on a Thursday morning in a Montana winter who had come through something real and were still there on the other side of it together. Chamu. The weeks that followed were the quietest Clara had experienced since arriving at Blackwood Ranch, and quiet was something she discovered she'd forgotten she needed. There was work. There was always work, and the winter didn't ease the ranch's demands so much as shift them from summer urgency to winter endurance. The cattle needed consistent management. The equipment needed maintenance. The smokehouse needed monitoring through the cold months to ensure the stores were holding correctly, the temperature stable enough to prevent spoilage, and cold enough to maintain preservation. Clara ran the checks every morning. She knew each shelf by its position, each package by its weight and date, each batch by the specific qualities of its smoke and cure. The smokehouse had become something she knew the way she knew her own hands completely without needing to think about it. Skeeter started asking her questions on a daily basis that had nothing to do with the immediate work at hand. Questions about curing methods and food science, and the chemistry of smoke and salt that told her his interest had moved from helper to student, without him fully realizing it. She answered every question with the patience her father had shown her, which was the particular patience of someone who understands that knowledge wants to be passed on and finds its own route if you let it. One morning she brought out one of her father's journals. Not the one with all the technical tables, that one she kept in her coat pocket close to hand, the way you keep something irreplaceable. But a second one, the one where he'd written his thinking rather than his numbers, his observations about the process, the philosophy behind the practice. She set it on the supply crate beside Skeeter. He looked at it, looked at her. "You can read it if you want," she said. "Not borrow it, read it here." He handled it the way she'd hoped he would, carefully, with the particular reverence of someone who understood they were holding something old and important. He read for an hour while she worked, asking questions when he came to something he didn't understand, and the questions he asked told her he was reading it the right way, not for the information, but for the thinking behind the information. At the end of the hour, he set it down gently and said, "Your father was a wise man." "He was," Clara said. "He knew you were going to need this." Skeeter looked at the journal. Not just the knowledge, the fact of it, that someone thought to write it down for you. Clara looked at him, 20 years old and already seeing things that took most people 40 years to understand. "That's exactly right," she said. "My father didn't leave me anything like that," Skeeter said. Not with self-pity, just with the honest acknowledgement of a fact. He left before he could. Clara sat down on the stool across from him. "What do you remember about him?" Skeeter thought about it seriously, the way he thought about everything she asked him, giving it real time. "He was patient," he said finally. "He never yelled. Even when things went wrong, he just got quiet and figured out the next step." He paused. "I try to do that." "You do?" Clara said. "I've watched you." He looked at her with the expression she'd come to recognize as his version of being moved, the eyes going slightly wider, the careful stillness. "Yeah. Every time something goes sideways, you get quiet before you act. That's not accident. That's who you are. And it came from somewhere." He looked down at the journal on the crate. "You think he'd be proud?" "I think he already was," Clara said. "I think fathers who raise sons like you didn't do it by accident. He saw who you were going to be." She paused. "He left you something. Just not on paper." Skeeter was quiet for a long time. Then he picked up the journal and handed it back to her with both hands. "Thank you," he said, "for letting me read it." Clara took it. She looked at the worn cover, her father's handwriting on the first page, the familiar weight of it in her hands. "He'd have liked you," she said. He had a saying. He said the best thing you can do with what you know is, give it to someone who'll do more with it than you did. She looked at Skeeter. "I think he'd have said that about you." Skeeter put his hat on. He stood up. His jaw was set in the careful way of someone holding something fragile very deliberately. "I'll go check the north side cattle," he said. "Good idea," Clara said. He walked out. Clara sat alone in the smokehouse for a moment with her father's journal in her hands, and the winter pressing quiet against the walls, and the fire doing what a good fire always does, holding steady, giving heat, asking nothing back. She put the journal in her coat pocket. Depool. The morning that changed everything again came in the second week of November. when the snow had settled into the permanent commitment of a Montana winter, and the ranch had found its cold season rhythm. Ethan came to the smokehouse before first light. She heard him coming across the yard while it was still dark, and knew from the pace, not hurried, not urgent, but with a particular purposefulness, that he was coming with something on his mind. She opened the door before he knocked. He stopped. She stood in the doorway with the firelight behind her, and he stood in the pre-dawn snow with his breath making white clouds, and they looked at each other across the threshold. "I said I was going to wait until spring," he said. "You did say that," Clara agreed. "I've decided spring is too far away." She looked at him steadily. "All right." He reached into his coat pocket. He produced a small object that she couldn't see clearly in the dark until he held it out toward the firelight, a ring, simple and plain, silver or white gold. The kind of ring a man buys when he doesn't want to make a statement with the object, but with the meaning of it. "I know this isn't—" He stopped, gathered himself the way he gathered himself before saying anything important, with a moment of stillness that was itself its own kind of eloquence. "I know this isn't how it's supposed to go. I know there's supposed to be more time and more certainty and more everything, but I've been standing in my own house for 3 years, feeling like half of it was missing. And you've been in this valley for 6 weeks, and I cannot remember what it felt like before you were here." Clara looked at the ring. "You're asking me," she said. "I'm asking you," he said. "Not because the ranch needs you. The ranch needed you, and you gave it what it needed, and it will carry that forward regardless. I'm asking because I need you. Because I have watched you stay at a fire all night for a place that hadn't even decided yet whether it deserved you. Because you walked 6 miles in October cold for one chance and made that one chance into something no one could take away." He met her eyes. "Because you are the most complete person I have ever stood next to, and I would like to stand next to you for the rest of my life, if you'll have me." The snow fell around them, and the fire held steady behind her, and the Blackwood Ranch stretched out in the pre-dawn dark. The smokehouse and the barn, and the mended fences, and the full shelves, and all the work of all the weeks contained in every post and every board of every building. Clara looked at Ethan Blackwood. She thought about the woman who had stood at a post outside Garrison's general store with $2 and a worn travel bag and her father's knowledge in her head and nothing else, and had pulled an advertisement off a post because the job was still available, and that meant something needed doing. She thought about the iron key he had placed in her hand without fully believing in her, and the way she had placed everything she had against that doubt until it became something else entirely. She thought about Skeeter catching snowflakes with his mouth open, and Garrett touching the fence post, and Doyle saying, "My father would have hired you on the spot," and Margaret Holt riding out on a gray mare because she'd been watching since the morning at Garrison's store and had decided it was time to say something. She thought about her father writing in his journals so she wouldn't have to carry everything alone. She reached out and took the ring from Ethan's hand. She didn't put it on yet. She held it for a moment, feeling the weight of it, not heavy, but present. The way things are present when they mean what they're supposed to mean. "You left the spring agreement behind pretty fast," she said. The corner of his mouth moved. "I decided winter was more honest." "It is," Clara agreed. She put the ring on. She looked up at him. "Well then," she said. "We have a ranch to run." He stepped through the doorway and into the warmth of the smokehouse, and she closed the door behind both of them, and the fire held the way. A good fire always holds when it's been built correctly, steady and warm, and completely reliable in the dark. By the time the first hard freeze locked the valley into its deepest winter, the Blackwood Ranch had become something the county talked about in the way it talked about things that had survived against expectation and were stronger for the surviving. The stores held. Every last pound of what Clara had cured lasted through the winter without a single spoiled batch, not one which Walsh noted in a formal addendum to his evaluation that was less about the legal record and more about the professional record, the acknowledgement from one person of proven judgment to the work of another. Aldous Crane's smokehouse was operational by spring, assessed and planned by Clara, over 2 days in March, that Ethan accompanied her for sitting in the corner of Crane's operation with his coffee and his quiet, and making no suggestions whatsoever, because he understood absolutely that this was her domain. Ruth Calloway's smokehouse followed in April. She didn't need 2 days. She needed one long conversation with Clara at her kitchen table, and a list of specifications she could execute herself, which was exactly what Clara gave her. Ruth sent a letter 3 weeks later that said simply, "First batch clean." You were right about the wood. Clara kept the letter. Skeeter stayed at Blackwood Ranch. He had not, as far as anyone could tell, seriously considered leaving. By summer, he had taken on a formal role managing the supplemental curing operations under Clara's direction, and his questions had evolved from basic to specific to expert in the way that happens when someone with the right instincts is given the right teaching. Clara wrote some of what she taught him down in a journal she bought from Garrison's store, not the same kind her father had used, but close enough. She didn't tell Skeeter the journal existed. She was going to give it to him eventually. Garrett was still at the ranch. He was different than he'd been in ways that were hard to articulate and easy to see. He was easier in himself somehow, as if the thing he'd been bracing against for years had resolved, and the energy that had gone into the bracing was now available for something else. He still crossed his arms when he was thinking, and still said things bluntly, and still deferred to no one when it came to the cattle. But he didn't brace against what he didn't understand anymore. He asked instead. The change was small, and it was everything. Doyle remained exactly who he'd been. Steady, observant, present. Clara had decided that Doyle was not someone who changed because he didn't need to. He'd arrived at himself already and was simply maintaining it, which was its own kind of rare. Harlan Pruitt did not come back to the Blackwood Gate. He didn't disappear from the Valley Men. Like Pruitt don't disappear, they recede and regroup and find other angles on other properties in other seasons. But he did not come back for the Blackwood note. Walsh had made that particular ground too solid, and Pruitt had the intelligence at minimum to recognize solid ground when he'd tried everything he had against it. On the last evening of November, Clara stood inside the smokehouse alone for a few minutes before supper. The stores were full. The fire was low-banked for the night, in the particular way she'd developed over the months a configuration that held heat through the cold hours, without requiring attention until morning. The shelves behind her held the work of a seasoned patient and complete. She held the iron key in her hand. The one Ethan had given her on the first day, the old one worn smooth at the top, that had unlocked a door no one had opened in 2 years. She'd carried it every day since. She'd thought about that sometimes in the early weeks, about the weight of a key to something abandoned, and what it meant to be the person who was given it, and what it cost to open a door that everyone else had decided was better left closed. She set the key on the shelf beside the fire. Not putting it down permanently, just setting it down for a moment the way you set down something heavy when you want to look at it clearly. She looked at it. The woman who had walked 6 miles in October cold had become the woman whose name was on this land. The woman no one had hired had become the woman the valley called on. The woman who had carried everything alone had found a place to set it down, and people to stand beside her when she did. Not because anyone rescued her. She had never needed rescuing. She had needed what everyone needs, a door that opened when she pushed it and the chance to show what she could do once she was through it. Ethan appeared in the doorway. "Supper's ready," he said. Clara picked up the key. She put it back in her coat pocket, right beside her father's journal, where it had been since the first day and would remain. She looked at Ethan Blackwood, her partner, the man who had handed her a key without believing in what it would open, and who had been the first person in longer than she cared to count, to look at what she built, and say simply, "I want you to stay." "Coming," she said. She walked through the door into the cold, into the warm light of the main house, where Skeeter was already at the table, and Garrett was pouring coffee, and Doyle was saying something dry that made Garrett almost smile, and the kitchen was full of the sound of people who had come through a hard season together and found themselves on the other side more than they'd been going in. The abandoned smokehouse had become the heart of the ranch. The woman no one sent for had become the name on the deed. The key to a forgotten door had unlocked something no one expected. Not just winter stores, not just a debt paid and a man saved and a valley changed. It had unlocked the truth that had been there all along, waiting for the right person to be stubborn enough and skilled enough and brave enough to walk through. Some women arrive like weather unannounced, unstoppable, and absolutely certain about what they intend to do. Clara Whitmore arrived in October. By November, the Blackwood Ranch would not have known how to be itself without her. And that was exactly as it should have been from the moment she pressed her hand flat against that cold iron door and pushed it open, not waiting for permission, not asking whether she was welcome, but walking in because the work was there, and she was the one who knew how to do it. She had never needed anyone to believe in her first. She just needed them to get out of the way long enough to see what she could build.